Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion number 4719 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham on Road to Recovery Drugs Strategy. Can I remind all members that time is extremely tight and I'm going to have to hold you to your allocated time. I call Rosanna Cunningham to speak to you. Move the motion, Minister. You've got 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In May 2008, this Parliament and MSPs from all parties endorsed Scotland's first recovery-focused drug strategy, the Road to Recovery. For the first time, we had a strategy setting out a long-term vision of recovery for Scotland and giving a message of hope to individuals, families and communities whose lives are affected by drugs. 2 years later, my predecessor Fergus Ewing provided an update to this Parliament. This focused on the progress made in implementing the strategy and acknowledged the commitment and dedication of those working to make recovery possible. The strategy was unanimously endorsed by Parliament for a second time. In June, I was pleased to take part in the Families Debate initiated by the Conservative Party, where we spoke about the impact of drug problems on families and all of the work that is going on across Scotland to help and support families in their recovery journeys. And now, 4 years on from the original introduction of Road to Recovery, 2 years on from the 2010 update, I would like to use this opportunity to do the following. Further update Parliament on progress, to highlight the ongoing and continuing plans for enabling recovery and implementing the strategy, and to recognise the significant efforts and personal dedication of frontline workers and all those working to deliver and support recovery. We are in very different circumstances now compared with 2007. Prior to 2007, there was no overall strategy. There was also a culture of under-resourced services. In 4 short years since the 2008 introduction of the strategy, we have significantly changed the landscape. Over that period, £162 million has been invested in frontline drug treatment services, exceeding our manifesto commitment. We have maintained the funding year on year despite a backdrop of economic austerity. That continued investment recognises the significant ambition of the strategy and offers an opportunity of recovery for people struggling with drug problems. We also recognise that financial investment alone was not enough. That is why we established 30 alcohol and drug partnerships to support the delivery of recovery across Scotland. Each partnership has a local strategy focused on helping individuals, families and communities recover from the damaging impact that drug and alcohol can cause. Now, since 2007, we also know that drug use amongst adults in Scotland has fallen and that levels of drug use amongst young people are now at their lowest in a decade. Among 15-year-olds, there has been a fall from 23% in 2002, when Labour was in power, to 11% in 2010. Prevention is also essential, and the statistics there show our approach is working. However, we can never become complacent. Curriculum for Excellence is the bedrock of prevention activity across Scotland. To support this, we've invested over £5 million since 2007-08 in a national programme of substance misuse education. The Innovative Choices for Life initiative, delivered in partnership with the Scottish Crime and Drugs Enforcement Agency, provides an interactive alcohol, drugs and tobacco education programme for school children across Scotland from primary 7 up to S6. Activities are provided throughout the year, supported by a website launched in September, and an online event for P7s was broadcast only yesterday. Our Know the Score website and helpline continues to offer credible and accessible advice and support 24 hours a day. And all of this work is closely tied to our ongoing efforts on new drugs, or so-called legal highs. This government is very serious about identifying and addressing any threats to the health of people in Scotland. So we continue to work with the UK Government, other devolved administrations and Scottish police forces to gather and share information on these substances and their dangers. We are not just waiting for these substances to be banned, but continue to ensure that information is available to those who need it. For people who need help with their existing drug problems, we are ensuring that they get faster access to the support they need. Before 2007, waiting times of over a year for drug treatment were not uncommon and frequently raised in this chamber, as longer-standing members will recall. Changing that was a priority. 4 years on, and statistics show the progress made. 90% of people started treatment for their drug problem within 3 weeks of their referral between April and June 2012. And that's achieving the target that we set for March 2013, coming in 9 months ahead of that target schedule. In 2011-12, 15,600 people started drug treatment and began their recovery journey. This is in addition to the 40,000 people who received a specialist assessment of their drug use and care needs between 2007 and 2011. And now that we have reached this high level of national performance, we are committed to ensuring this access to treatment is sustained and that people in all parts of Scotland get the treatment they need. However, it bears repeating, of course.
Richard Simpson.
The Minister would agree with me that it isn't just about getting people into treatment or starting them on the road to recovery, but actually sustaining them and holding them in treatment.
Absolutely be in accord with that statement. And it does bear repeating, and I'm sure the member will agree with me, that recovery means different things at different times for different people. And decisions about the most appropriate treatment can only ever be made on an individual basis. That applies to methadone as to every other treatment option. Does methadone reduce drug-related deaths, blood-borne viruses and crime? We know it does. Does it stabilise lives? Yes, it does. But methadone is only one of a number of treatment options available. We are clear that it can be effective, but only as one component in a package of care, treatment and recovery. Members, however, should remember that not all drug problems are opiate-based. We know that of the 19,000 drug treatments started in 2011-12, fewer than 1/5 were for prescribed drug treatment, including but not exclusively methadone. There is an assumption, a tendency to assume out there that everybody is on methadone, and that simply is not true. Sadly, however, we must recognise that we lost 584 people to drug-related death in Scotland last year. Each one of these deaths is a family and community tragedy. But actually we know that of that number, only 14 may be wholly attributable to methadone. In most deaths, more than one substance was found, and in nearly all deaths, alcohol was also a contributing factor. That is the reality. But I do want to make sure that all drug services in Scotland are high quality, effective and recovery focused. And that is why I recently commissioned the Chief Medical Officer, supported by expert members of the Independent Drug Strategy Delivery Commission, to gather evidence on opiate replacement therapies used to treat people with drug addiction. I look forward to sharing the findings of this group with Parliament in spring 2013. We have also introduced a world-leading naloxone programme to support those most vulnerable to opiate overdose. This is an important intervention within a range of available treatment and support which can help to reduce harm and support people towards recovery, and at a very fundamental level can bring people back from the brink of death. In the programme's first year, 3,500 take-home naloxone kits were issued, but we are still in progress of rolling out that programme. I recognise that evidence is essential if we are to maintain a clear sense of what progress looks like. Much of the information that we needed to deliver the strategy was simply not available in 2008, and that is why we have continued to invest in data collection and analysis. For example, for the first time, we have a range of evidence which has allowed us to identify the ageing population of people with drug problems in Scotland, the group of people I have termed the train-spotting generation. After years, decades even, of drug use, many have become increasingly unwell and are experiencing a number of other chronic health conditions in addition to their drug use. We now know more than we have ever known about the people we are supporting, but we don't know everything and there are still gaps.
I'm grateful to the Minister. She will recall that I have written to her recently because while I accept the point about availability of data, will she recognise that indeed the Scottish Drugs Misuse Database has been in existence in one form or another for more than 10 years, and that some of the data that is contained in that is valuable and should be used as a guide to the position over that longer period.
We continue to use every scrap of evidence that we can lay our hands on, and in fact, through our investment in the Scottish Drugs Misuse Database, we will start to get access to even more information from December 2012. From this report, we will know more about people in treatment and the outcomes they achieve, which I think has been one of the concerns that we didn't have enough information about, such as for housing, employment and training, for example, for all types of treatments, not just for opiate replacement therapies. We need to look across the board at successful outcomes. From this,
Margaret MacDonald.
I thank the Minister for giving me, because we're well into her speech, and that's why I interrupt to ask about cocaine. According to the UN report, Scotland has the highest cocaine use in the world. And so, therefore, we should be looking at that as a special case just now, because there's different qualities of cocaine coming onto the market, and it looks as though it's going to be a repeat performance of what happened when you get different qualities of heroin coming on, people overdosing.
Minister.
There is a significant debate around the figures that have been published in regard to cocaine, and some of the figures that are being used from these international databases are very out of date, and it is worth actually looking very closely at what they are in fact measuring. But we are aware that there is a cocaine issue in Scotland that needs to be addressed as well. I can reassure the member of that. But I do want to emphasise that the work that we're doing is not just looking at outcomes for opiate replacement therapies, but for all types of treatment, because that will help us balance which are working best. I'm also committed to improving the evidence on what recovery actually looks like, especially on the wider outcomes that people in recovery achieve, such as I said, for housing, employment and training. There's also a growing grassroots recovery movement throughout Scotland, led by organisations such as the Scottish Recovery Consortium, Scottish Families Affected by Drugs, the Scottish Drugs Forum and Scottish Training on Drugs and Alcohol. We've established the world's first recovery consortium. Through their recovery campaigns and Recovery College, it's encouraging to see that the visibility of recovery is increasing, the role of advocacy is getting stronger, and the voice of those in recovery is getting louder. There are challenges, though, which the director of the Recovery Consortium described so well, and I quote, "People in recovery from addiction do not stand out in a crowd, they are anonymous, quietly going about their business of living life on life's terms. If they didn't tell you they were in recovery, you might never know." So how can we tell people are recovering? Mutual aid and peer support are essential. There are 180 Narcotics Anonymous meetings taking place daily in Scotland. 97 of these are in Glasgow alone. And there are now fast-growing locally based recovery communities like Edinburgh's Serenity Cafe, Fife's Restoration Cafe and Glasgow's recovery groups. Each of these provides a safe social setting for people in recovery. It's also encouraging to see a growing virtual recovery community, which is providing support to people across Scotland wherever they live. There are currently more than 1,000 Scottish members of the online Wired Into Recovery. And recovery is also increasingly visible, building on the success of Scotland's first National Recovery Walk in 2010, which promoted and celebrated recovery. I was pleased to hear about Ayer's Recovery Walk and Aberdeen's First Recovery Day. There are many individuals, groups and organisations helping to make recovery possible in Scotland, but it starts with an individual's strength, determination and hope for something better. To take hold, it needs the nurture and the enduring support of those closest to us, the family. Families need support too, and that's why the work that's done by Scottish Families Affected by Drugs is so important. William White, a world expert in recovery based in the United States, supported this type of approach when he argued that the leadership of the recovery movement must come from the recovery community and the movement's agenda must be that of recovering people and their families. Evidence like this confirms that the approach we are taking to recovery in Scotland is the right one. We want to build on these achievements and continue to support the development of recovery communities. Now, Scotland in 2012 looks a lot different, has changed for the better, but that changed landscape means we must continue to adapt and evolve the road to recovery. So the next phase is to focus on quality and making sure that the delivery is right across Scotland. I've spoken about the work that we continue to do, and as members will know, I have set up an independent expert advice panel to gather evidence on opiate replacement therapies, and that will continue to support us in learning how to make the road to recovery work for the landscape in which we now find ourselves. But I want to warn all members about the dangers of stigma attached to this issue, because stigma is one of the biggest challenges people who are using drugs have to face, and we cannot and must not do anything irresponsible, which increases that level of stigma. So I want to build on the success we've had so far, move forward, and I look forward to a full debate today. I hope it is constructive and responsible. Thank you.
I now call on Jenny Mara to speak to Move Amendment 4719.3. Ms Mara, you've got 10 minutes, but if you take interventions, can I warn you, it will come off your own time.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate on the Government's drug strategy today. When launched in 2008, the Scottish Government's drug strategy was supported throughout this chamber. Its primary focus on recovery was, and Labour believes still is, the right and proper method of how we best tackle drug addiction in our communities and on our streets. And there has been some success. For example, we welcome the latest statistics showing that 90% of those seeking addiction treatments are being seen within 3 weeks. This was an important target that has been met ahead of schedule, and for that I congratulate the Government, our NHS and drug and alcohol partnerships across Scotland. When Fergus Ewing laid out the strategic objectives of the Road to Recovery in 2008, he said, "The strategy puts in place the foundations for a sustained drive to recover lives and reduce the social and economic costs of drugs on our society." 4 years on, and over the last few months, we have seen these fundamental aims unravel to reveal the growing cost of a worsening drugs problem in Scotland. Because last year, nearly 600 people died of drug misuse, a fifth more than the previous year, and 3/4 more than in 2001. And of these people, the prescribed opiate substitute methadone contributed to almost half of these deaths. Now, this statistic is tragic and shows what we believe are the fatal consequences of a system that has gone stale under this Government's stewardship. I want to tell you the story of Matt Dempsey, who's 44, from Postle Park. Speaking to a national newspaper recently, he said, "I've been on methadone since I got out of prison in 2004. I got addicted to heroin while I was inside. I would love to get off methadone and heroin, but I've never been offered any help to do that." Now, Mark's story is not unusual, because time after time we hear of drug addicts who feel trapped on the methadone programme without the necessary additional support to get clean. For people like Mark, methadone has become an end in itself. And Mark has little chance of finding a job because he has to queue for methadone every day. And without the necessary help and support, the chaotic lifestyle of addicts like Mark mean they turn back to other substances before too long.
John Finney.
I'm grateful for the member accepting an intervention. Would the member accept from me that there are individuals on the methadone programme who are holding down jobs and actually contributing greatly to society in the process?
Jenny Mara.
Absolutely, I would agree with the member. What I'm suggesting is an alternative for some drug addicts, and I'll elaborate on that. Because becoming trapped in a cycle of substance misuse and failure, this leads, as the drug death statistics have shown, to tragic consequences. And I think the fact that the Government can't answer basic questions on the effectiveness of the methadone programme is deeply concerning. Because without the ability to assess it, the true impact of methadone to the recovery of addicts like Mark and our wider society cannot be properly measured. And while we recognise, as I said to Mr Finney, the advantages methadone brings as one part of a comprehensive drug strategy, yes.
Minister.
I would like to tell us how many of these questions would have been answerable prior to 2007 when her party was in government.
Jenny Mara.
Presiding Officer, the Government have had 5 years, and as I stated earlier in my speech, this problem has got worse and worse and worse. And I would ask her to take responsibility today rather than putting it back onto an administration that was here 5 years ago. Because while we recognise the advantages that methadone bring as one part of a comprehensive drug strategy, we need to know that public money is being spent to do more than simply strand addicts on a system that won't let all of them recover. The cost to the Scottish taxpayer of funding methadone has reached a staggering high of £36 million a year. And of that figure, locally negotiated rates for dispensing methadone means that public money is being used to pay companies different rates to do the same job. Since 2007-08, the cost of dispensing and supervising methadone has increased by £4.4 million. Within that increase, figures obtained by Scottish Labour show that some pharmacists are being paid up to 42% more than the base rate to dispense the drug. Let me explain. In the borders, where methadone use is comparatively low, pharmacists receive £1.75 for each dose that they dispense. But in Ayrshire and Arran, one of the worst affected areas, the fee rises to £2.49. We don't believe this is fair, and we don't believe the Scottish people do either. We believe that in its review, the Government should look at the allocation of public resources to the drug strategy and ask what measures can be taken to address this postcode anomaly. Doing so has the potential to generate investment for other treatments that would help people addicted to drugs. Yes.
Christine Graham.
You mentioned the borders, the amount that pharmacies got there and the amount that was given elsewhere, and I didn't know the point of it. I mean, I may have been drifting, but try not to drift in your speech. But can you explain me the point of that?
Presiding Officer, there are locally negotiated rates which lead to more profits for some dispensers than others. We believe it should be a flat rate across the country and invest those savings into rehabilitation. I'd like to expand the point on rehabilitation, if that's okay, because residential rehabilitation centres are key to this. These centres offer intensive and full-time support to recovering addicts. They have been heralded for their success in achieving what we all believe the drug strategy should achieve: recovery and rebuilding lives. I think I'd like to make a bit of progress. I've taken several interventions, thank you, Mr Stewart. But today, those centres are chronically underused. Minister, in Glasgow at the Phoenix Futures Centre, half of the beds are empty, at a time when Glasgow's drug death rate made up a third of all drug deaths in Scotland last year. Beechwood House in Inverness is at 40% capacity. And shamefully, in my region, in Dundee, there are no residential rehabilitation centres at all, despite Dundee's growing and significant drug problem. With the money saved by renegotiating the amount we paid to pharmacies on the regional variations, as I explained to Christine Graham, we could invest in these centres. We could progress the Government's drug strategy by providing better local services that are tailored to the individual through alternative options like residential drug centres. Presiding Officer, we hope that in her upcoming review the Minister reflects on these suggestions. All of us in this chamber, I believe, want to see the drugs strategy succeed. But in order for this to happen, we need to work together to build a strategy that is more effective than what we currently have now. And we hope that the Scottish Government will supply the necessary leadership and political will to make this happen. Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my name.
I now call on Annabel Goldie to speak to move amendment number 4719.1. Ms Goldie, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I thank the Scottish Government for bringing forward this debate. I think putting it into a time frame provides a helpful perspective. The new strategy was a product of budget negotiations between my party and the Scottish Government back in 2008. Prior to that time, there was no strategy. Methadone was a management tool. And I remember saying then, with reference to the road to recovery, that road will be challenging and in places very rocky, but at least we are on it, and I think that remains important. And 4.5 years on, we do need to examine the pace of progress in delivering the strategy, as we also constantly need to explore fresh options and initiatives which may support that delivery. The general backdrop of prevalence of drug abuse in Scotland is still very troubling, and we know from official figures that drug users have increased substantially over the last decade. Reference has already been made in the debate to drug-related deaths, and it was a depressing statistic that the 2011 figures confirmed that for the first time the number of methadone-related deaths exceeded heroin-related deaths. It may be, however, that there has been a reduction in heroin users who are moving on to harm reduction programmes. We know that drug fines in prisons continue to present a challenge. There's a stubbornly high level of activity there, and recent figures disclose that there were over 1,700 fines last year, and for the 9 months up to 30th September of this year, 1,322. We also know drug offences recorded by the police showed an increase for 2011-12 from the preceding year. But as the Minister said, there is progress amongst younger people, and the question I do pose is, where would we be had this strategy never been put in place? Because I think it is instructive to remind ourselves of the main components. It was about making a fresh start, about preventing drug use and about promoting recovery. It was also about a range of appropriate treatment and rehabilitation services being available at a local level. But as the figures which I've been listing demonstrate, there is still a major challenge. And couple these with the disclosure that there is unused rehab capacity throughout Scotland, and I think we need to be investigating why that is. I think the very welcome review referred to in the motion would be a sensible way of doing that, hence the first part of my amendment. We should also note the overall number of residential drug treatment centres in Scotland has fallen since 2008-9 from 29 to 23. And I think that is regrettable because residential drug treatment centres do work. But let me now turn to methadone prescribing. Once again, can I try to put this issue into a context? Very unhelpful to any discussion.
Just on the point of residential rehab does work, does a member have any outcomes about the advantages of that and proof that it does work better than any of the other proposals?
Much of it anecdotal, I have to say, Mr McNeill, but having spoken to rehab facilities in my own area and taken at first hand the accounts of those who have recovered and seen the very positive and clean lives they're now leading, I think it is impressive. I have to say in relation to methadone prescribing that I think very unhelpful to any discussion is a polarisation of the debate. Because at one end of the spectrum is the view that methadone is of itself harmful and expensive and no one should ever be prescribed it. At the other end is a view that it's a positive intervention delivering a crime-free life of stability to the patient, and under no circumstances should anyone interfere with that. The true position is somewhere in between. I accept that depending on the individual, methadone may provide a bridge from the chaos of illegal using to a more stable existence. I have to say that I do consider sensationalist articles in tabloid newspapers unhelpful. But I would also consider it unfortunate, particularly when the road to recovery anticipates a range of options, if someone seeking help who did not want to be prescribed methadone was given no alternative. As has been indicated, we do know that methadone prescriptions have increased significantly, as have the costs. We don't know how many patients are on methadone. That information is not available, and we don't know how many patients have come off methadone or had their prescriptions reduced. Now, I have to say, I think it is quite difficult to make any objective assessment of the range of options available, as is implicit within the strategy if we do not have that basic data. But I do expect prescribers and their patients to be engaged in a judgment about whether a prescription could be reduced or ultimately ceased. And methadone patients who are constituents have told me that they have found it difficult to engage in such discussion, and some have been discouraged from even embarking upon it. But that such discussions can be usefully pursued is evident from the methadone cessation pilot in North East and South Ayrshire. And that pilot is under the Alcohol and Drug Partnerships aimed at supporting long-term methadone users. And the outcomes are positive. Anyone reading the report of the pilot can only come to that conclusion. A whole host of positive outcomes, not just in terms of cessation and reduction of scripts, but also moving on to education or even moving into employment. Presiding Officer, given the levels which methadone prescriptions have now reached, given that we know how many patients wish to be engaged in discussions about their programme, and given the success of that cessation pilot, I feel the review could look at how more information could be provided to the patient, hence the second strand of my amendment. But I also want the review to be open-minded about other replacement therapies. Has neuroelectric therapy a role to play? It is available in Scotland. How well does it work? What is the experience? Is there evidence? And there are many other positive areas for the review to explore. But I think underpinning this is the identity and the presence of a solid strategy which has a capacity to make a huge difference. And I thank the Minister for the debate, and I move the amendment in my name.
I now call on Willie Rennie to speak to move amendment number 4719.2. Mr Rennie, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, President Officer, and I also thank the Minister for bringing this debate forward today, because I think it's on a useful airing of this important issue. There are around about 60,000 drug users in Scotland, and one of them that I met when I visited the Turning Point facility in Glasgow was Mary. I'll call her Mary. She had a young son, and all her ambition was to be able to take her young son to school in the morning after giving him breakfast. That was her ambition, that lofty ambition that she had. For us, quite normal ambitions. We do it every day if we've got kids. But for her, this was an amazing ambition, and one that she didn't see the circumstances in which she could achieve that. Her son was getting looked after by her brother, almost on a permanent basis. Now, I say this because we talk about these big numbers, we talk about these big programmes. At the end of the day, these are normal people. These are normal people who deserve a chance like anybody else. And the way that we talk about this in some ways, we demonise these people and we demonise the way that they contribute or don't contribute to society. But for me, they deserve a chance. They would love to go back. They would love to go back and have another chance all over again. And I think, therefore, we should respect them for the challenges that they go through, because they are tremendously difficult. They go in and out of drug use, sometimes in remission, sometimes they relapse and go back into serious drug use. And that's the chaotic life that these people lead. Mary was on methadone, along with 24,000 other people who are on methadone. But for me, at the centre of this is about the health professionals choosing what is the right way to proceed. It's not for politicians to decide which treatment can or cannot be used. It's for them to be given the tools, because they've got the evidence, they've got the know-how, they are the best people to make the decisions to help these people out of these circumstances. Recovery means different things for different people. Sometimes it's actually just being able to stay alive. For some other people, it's getting back into work. It's different things for different people. For Mary, it's being able to take her son to school in the morning. So that's why I think it's really regrettable, some of the stuff that's been happening, I have to say, in the Daily Record, supported by some in the Labour Party. Because the way that we demonise the pharmacists just for doing their job, I think, is deeply, deeply regrettable. Another important point about this, we often just focus on the medical aspects of this, but much of it is about their whole life experience. It's about the fact that they've maybe got mental health problems, that they have housing problems, debt, they have got a chaotic family life, maybe they've had divorce, maybe they've had experiences in the military that have led them into drug use and also alcohol. So we've actually got to sort out many of those issues as well if we're going to expect these people to recover on a long-term basis. But we've also got to recognise that sometimes they are just going to be in that chaotic lifestyle for some time. The simplistic view that we can somehow get these people automatically into recovery if only we change one little thing is just not going to happen. I've been to some of the projects, the LEAP project in Edinburgh, and I saw the abstinence regime there. Right for some people. It wasn't right for everybody, but it was right for some people. And they brought the whole family in to share the experience, to make sure that these people were able to recover on a long-term basis. The other aspect of this is that it is such a shame on this country that we've got such a high proportion of drug users when we have got such wealth. And a lot of this is the root of this is poverty, the pockets of poverty we've got in many communities. And again, we have to deal with that if we're going to expect any longer-term benefits. Certainly.
Thank him for giving reasons, because it's so tight. But can I caution him against assuming that everyone who's taking drugs is poor? Because there's now a strand of people with a lot of money who have started taking drugs.
No, I accept that. But a lot of it is associated with poverty, and we should not ignore that. Just on methadone, if you look at Russia, the HIV rates in Russia, where they don't have the same kind of programme as we've got in Scotland, HIV rates amongst drug users is about 1 in 3. In Scotland, it's less than 1 in 20. I don't know what more evidence you need than that simple statistic. There's lots of scientific studies as well that show that Hep C reduction is about 80% as a result of these needle exchange and methadone programmes. If you look at Eilish Angelini's report about Cornton Vale, when they took a lot of the women who were sent to Cornton Vale off the methadone programme, the self-harm rates just shot up. Now, there's no coincidence to that. There is a significant benefit that you can get from methadone. Now, Annabel Goldie is right when she says that it's not necessarily right for everybody and it's not necessarily the only thing and it's not perfect. I accept that. But we should not say on death rates that the reason why so many people are dying is because of methadone, because it's not. 60% of those who've died where methadone is involved other drugs as well. 40% also involved alcohol. I'm
sorry, remember, this is in the last 30 seconds.
Also involved alcohol. But it also was illicit methadone in many cases, so it wasn't actually part of the programme. So to simply say that all these people are dying because of methadone is wrong. And that's part of the root problem of this. Methadone is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And we need to be very careful when we demonise pharmacists and we demonise the methadone programme, because otherwise we might underdo the good work that is underway.
I now call on George Adam, followed by Richard Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate, and Willie Rennie is correct when he says this debate is about real people and their real issues and the lives that they lead, because I think we have to remember that when we make these decisions and have these debates and discuss things within the media, because this is a complex issue, and if it was a very easy matter to fix, then we would have found one a long time ago and we wouldn't still be looking for reasons to try and sort things out. But in May 2008, the Parliament, as a cross-party grouping, agreed that Scotland's national drugs strategy, the road to recovery, was the way forward, and they took the right approach to support individuals into sustained recovery from problem drug use. The fact that the Scottish Government is investing £28.6 million for frontline drug treatment and recovery services in 2012-13, which is an increase of 20%, is to be welcomed, and the Scottish Government's national drug strategy, the road to recovery, states, in the executive summary, actually states the issue very well in the beginning. Central to the strategy is a new approach tackling problem drug use based firmly on the concept of recovery. Recovery is a process through which an individual is enabled to move on from their problem drug use towards a drug-free life and become an active and contributing member of society. For me, that's the most important issue and the most important fact with regards to all of this. And the fact that, obviously, as things moved on in April 2012, the Scottish Government, along with COSLA, the NHS, issued the Alcohol and Drug Partnership Planning and Reporting Guidance, ensuring that all these things could work at a local level as well and feed into single outcome agreements within local authorities, because what may work in certain areas may not work in other areas as well. So there will be a scope for local involvement at that as well. And I think when we're looking at, I've heard complaints from constituents, and I've even complained myself at some times when we're talking about methadone, about people within some of the pharmacies across the country. My own wife has a long-term condition through no fault of her own and has been getting, obviously, medication. And there have been complaints from people who have used it. But when I mentioned this to the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, they invited me along to one of their new pharmacies in Paisley, the Abbey Pharmacy, and they explained to me how they were dealing with the issue in a more modern, thoughtful way, so that all of their customers and the people they were caring for in a professional manner were looked after. And the most important thing about that was, during my visit there, I actually got the chance to see someone, a constituent, who was on the methadone programme, and he quite rightly was quite happy to see me because he had a number of complaints about things happening in the area. So, but during that, when I was talking to him, that makes it real. It's back to what Willie Rennie quite rightly said. You meet the people, you don't just talk about the stigma, you don't just talk about the fact that they are a drug user, you see the actual human being in the person for what they are, and that makes the difference as well. So one of the other things that I had when we were going round various businesses in the area was the fact that one of the store managers was quite surprised that there was this treatment room within one of the pharmacies in her area as well, because she thought it would be for something else when it said treatment room. She thought it would be for someone's nails or cosmetic things. It was only when the pharmacist explained it to her exactly what it was there for that she could see the reason why, because it's one of the biggest complaints that people get. And the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, in their briefing, said the treatment with methadone is not a cure for addiction, but as an oral treatment it reduces the harm associated with the use of illegal drugs and can help to stabilise drug misusers and promote recovery. Now, for me, that has to be the most important issue and way forward for this. Lots of times when I'm speaking in the Parliament, I tend to talk about things at a local level and within Paisley and Renfrewshire, and this time I will talk about it again because it's something that we have to mention. And in Renfrewshire's Alcohol and Drugs Partnership is involved with lots of community groups in the area, and particularly in Paisley's West End, which includes Fergusley Park. They are working with the WISH group, which they've given funding for, which is West End is Safer and Healthier. And it's a group that's looking at a holistic attitude to how people that are living in some of the areas, some of the poorest areas of the areas of highest deprivation in the whole of Scotland, and they're looking at better ways where they can make life better for themselves, and that includes families that are got people with drug and alcohol problems as well. And it's one of the things we currently have in Renfrewshire is we have a situation where the Director of Social Work will quite publicly say we may have a third generation drug user in a family. And that's a situation where we have to find a way to make sure that we can get these families and work with them. And I'm glad, as part of Renfrewshire Alcohol and Drug Partnership, they've provided funding for activities for kinship carers in particular, because when families break down because of drug use or anything else, it's other members within the family that tend to pick up the pieces as well. And it's an issue that I've had to deal with over the years, whether it be as a councillor beforehand or as now as a member of the Scottish Parliament. But I would just like to close, Presiding Officer, and say this debate is not about methadone. It's not about pharmacies who administer it. Neither is it about many of the drug users who, because of sometimes tragically chaotic lifestyles, find themselves on the road to recovery. This is about people and how we as a society can work together to ensure that all of our citizens are given an opportunity to thrive and live life to its full. We could sit here all day and discuss the negative factors, but we have to do something. And this was an easy problem to, if this was an easy problem to solve, as I said earlier, we'd have done it by now. But that doesn't mean we panic and lose hope.
I regret, Mr Adam, your time's up. Richard Simpson, followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll start with the areas of implementation and drug policy with the Government. I think is to be commended. The introduction of the naloxone programme, which is being delivered in a very measured way, supported by the Scottish Drugs Forum, I think is extremely welcome. The new and welcome waiting time targets appear to be largely met. But I would urge the Government to get the Scottish Drugs Forum to undertake a survey to make sure that there is no gaming involved in these waiting times, as I have raised on others, because I've had some indications personally from those working in the field that some users are being offered assessment and treatment in a tick-box way to meet the targets, but in fact these offers are not realistic, and so I would urge you to have a look at that. Fergus Ewing, her predecessor, went to some trouble to engage members from another party, and my party signed up to the road recovery quite comfortably. We did so partly because we had already established pilots embracing abstinence, such as the LEAP project in Edinburgh, which has got some problems with its premises now, but is a welcome development. Also, we'd established a programme of alternatives to prison, and I think that should not be forgotten, and I think other speakers will address this. But drug courts, DTTOs, and the Time Out Centre for Women Offenders at 218 Bath Street. It's a regrettable fact that that hasn't been replicated, and the Angelini report said that should happen. I would urge it to be piloted for men as well. One further important reason was the recognition by this government that the methadone has a significant evidence-based tool in reducing HIV and improving community safety by reducing criminality, and also as a first step in recovery for many. In response to Willie Rennie's comment, the British Medical Journal this month said that 54% of the reduction in HIV can actually be ascribed to the methadone programme. I welcome the Minister's reconfirmation that methadone will, in fact, be used extensively for the initial treatment of opiate addiction. And what the review should, however, concentrate on, I believe, is the delivery of methadone. Pharmacists who participate are being paid small sums, but cumulatively these can run into millions for some of the chains like Boots and Lloyd's. And I believe there at least should be a nationally negotiated dispensing fee. The other bits of the contract with the pharmacists are national. This should be national too. If it's very quick,
Margot MacDonald.
I thank the member for giving me. Is it possible to have a national dispensing policy when the small chemist in the outer aisles might only have a few to dispense, but the bigger chemist has much more business displacement?
I think that it's possible to discount on a national fee, but we shouldn't have the variation that we've got at the moment, where Ayrshire and Anne have the largest prescribing and have the largest fees. My concern, however, is about the deaths due to diversion of methadone. How many prosecutions have there been for diversion? Some pharmacists undertake the work as a service to their community, but one they would rather not do. And if there was an alternative, this might be welcome. So I would again propose that the review should consider recommending a pilot in a high-usage area where the NHS itself takes on dispensing 7 days a week under the supervision of a pharmacist prescriber. I have to say that when I arrived in Edinburgh as an addiction specialist in 2004 and saw the contract for the proposed local enhanced scheme for general practitioners, I was frankly appalled. The requirement under the scheme was minimal. Frankly, too many patients were and are being parked on methadone, and there were minimum testing requirements. I would recommend again that there should be a national enhanced contract for general practitioners, and this should move over time to only being given to those GPs who have specific qualifications in treating drug misuse and are prepared to provide the holistic wraparound care that Willie Rennie pointed out is critical to moving people on. Labour and the SNP have both promoted prescribing by qualified health professionals other than doctors, but the very slow implementation of protocols has meant that nursing and pharmacists, having been trained, are not able to use their skills because 14 different health boards are creating 14 different protocols, and they've done so very slowly. This is a resource we are wasting, and it means that we have to use more expensive resources. Now, drug deaths, when I was the Justice Minister at the current Minister's place in 2002, were 382. I introduced the Know the Score approach, and drug deaths actually reduced over the next 3 years, only rising again in 2006, and now increasing from 382 when I was Minister to 584. But I have to say that drug deaths in the United Kingdom, including Scotland, peaked in 2008 and have actually reduced steadily since. Why, again, is Scotland different? I don't have an explanation, but I just asked the question. One concern I have was highlighted by the UK Drug Policy Commission, chaired by Baroness Runciman, and that is that some clinicians are precipitously withdrawing treatment from those that relapse or are topping up. Now, it is entirely appropriate to challenge those who are topping up, but there are too many clinicians who adopt a judgmental and punitive approach to those who relapse. And some services may be achieving their waiting list targets by discharging patients in order to create space. In summary, Presiding Officer, in the last 10 seconds I've got, we need to examine the variations in prescribing, which are 3 times one area from another. We need to look at non-medical prescribers. We introduce a NES contract. We need to have a new time-out centre. We need to monitor the SPS services.
Thank you very much. I now call on Christine Graham to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I welcome in general the tone of this debate, which of course should not stop constructive criticism or recommendations. And of course we all know that this is a hard nut to crack. The solution is multidimensional and requires collaboration and cooperation of many agencies. These are cliches, we know all this. And we know also, and I agree with Willie Rennie, drug addiction is closely, not wholly related to poverty, to community circumstances, family and friends, their environment that you're brought up in. And I've yet to meet an addict who doesn't want freed of the personal prison that is addiction. We even have children born addicted because the addiction began in utero. But I welcome frontline treatment and the establishment of the alcohol and drugs partnerships, the key word being partnerships. And I also note the record funding in my own constituency. Key too is the drop in waiting times. Addicts need help from the moment they seek it, so any cut in delays is precious. Again, in my constituency, they've exceeded the target of 90% starting first treatment 3 weeks or less, and I commend them for this. Others have spoken about methadone and other replacements, but I want to focus on the impact and the possibilities of this strategy in both reducing crime and reoffending. I note from the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey 2010-11 that drug use decreased to 6.6% of adults 2010-2012. However, there are many now in their 40s and beyond who have been addicted, as others have said, for decades. In the report of Audit Scotland, Reducing Reoffending, paragraph 22, there was an analysis of data provided by the SPS that shows that in March of this year, 40% of all prisoners came from the most deprived areas in Scotland, compared to 15% of the Scottish population, and almost half of those, 44% of prisoners, also reported being under the influence of drugs at the time of their offence. And that profile is similar to reoffender populations in other countries, close quotes. Now, when we put that into the context, you see the relevance of drug addiction, the drug trade, and the impact on crime and reoffending is substantial. To buy drugs, you do have to steal, rob, and indeed peddle them. So the majority also are also male. In respect of women offenders, many also are habitual drug and alcohol addicts. Cottonvale has, but will more so, have a whole person and individual approach to helping break the addiction. And I think the committee generally were very welcome to see the reappointment of Kate Donoghue as governor of the prison, and indeed the new head of the SPS, and the drive to have Inverclyde as a custom-built prison for women prisoners and to rehabilitate. I too commend the 218 project in Glasgow, which I visited with colleagues last year. And again, the committee is keeping a note of how important these alternatives are. The motion rightly speaks of relevant and national and local agencies working together to drive the strategy forward. And frankly, there can be no greater requirement or indeed opportunity for cooperative working than between our courts, our prison service, health, housing and local authorities, both while the addict is in prison and most certainly when released, when the dealer might just be waiting at the gates to provide a freebie and in a stroke undo any good work achieved in the prison. And when I say to you that in 2010-2011 the average cost per prisoner place was just over £32,146, you see the waste of money. Latest figures on the SPS website also indicate that there were around recently 8,500 people in Scottish prisons. Of those, some 30% reoffend and reconvicted within 1 year. And if we accept the earlier figure that 44% are under the influence of drink, drugs at the time of the offence, and those who weren't under the influence but are there because of their addiction, and we could even reduce that reoffending through a focused strategy by 10%, you can do the maths and calculate the savings to the public purse, let alone the savings to the health service, social work, and so on, not just through the chaotic life of an addict offender, but to their families and the wider communities. What we must ensure is that money invested in the strategy, therefore, is spent appropriately and effectively. And one of the ways of evidencing that is a reduction in offending and indeed reoffending due to drugs abuse or drugs purchase or drug-related crime, and that would prove rock-solid evidence. I've finished.
Thank you. The member has finished. I'm now calling Graham Pearson to be followed by Brian Adam. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. For the sake of fairness and some comprehensive review, the Minister indicated that before 2008 there was no strategy in terms of drugs, but the Parliament did commit in the Millennium to tackling drugs in Scotland, action and partnerships. And the Road to Recovery, a new approach to tackling Scotland's drug problem, published in May 2008, certainly put some steel into what could be described as a strategy for the future. The document established a shift in policy from working simply to reduce harm to instead, in addition, to focusing on helping people become drug-free. It identified some key outcomes, and they've been referred to earlier: establishment of a national evidence group and the work with Information Statistics Division to deliver enhanced misused databases. And there was no doubt there was a need for this kind of information. Reducing harm and promoting recovery, a report on methadone treatment for substance misuse in Scotland was also produced in 2007. And the report included, amongst other things, the setting up of a national methadone audit process to ascertain the number of people on methadone and their current state of recovery, and supporting pilots of good practice alongside setting up strategic process to facilitate and coordinate quality research. In a previous life, I contributed to these consultation processes. I welcome the changes now in focus. It was something I supported and I still support to this day. The key question for me, however, for this debate is to review what improvements have occurred in the intervening years and are they taking us in the right direction. September 2010, Research for Recovery suggested the introduction of a Drugs Research Forum, saying that what was lacking in Scotland was clear evidence base about long-term pathways to recovery and the impact on families and community. In 2012, the 5th of September, the Minister gave an interview with the press and indicated her belief that there was a huge problem and that there are no figures to show whether our responses actually works. I agree with that assessment. She also said the whole point about the road to recovery is digging down and getting the kind of statistics we're talking about today. And whilst I would agree we need those statistics, in actual fact the strategy is about reducing addiction and utilising rehabilitation. She also mentioned that it can't be done overnight. It's again a backdrop of there having been nothing over the past 20 years. And I presume that would refer to the statistics that were available. And there's no doubt they were vague in the extreme and still are to some extent. But what about the policy of reducing harm and helping people be drug-free? What has happened? The Minister asked, how do we know if recovery is happening? Well, during the last 5 years, certainly 2,643 people have died as a result of drug overdose. A record number, unfortunately, dying in this last year alone. There is £8 million having been spent on methadone, and a further £28 million spent delivering methadone in 2011. That's a rise of 36% from the 2007 sum, and a 9% increase in the number of prescriptions. 22,000 people a year are prescribed it as an alternative to heroin. And United Nations statistics still show Scotland in the high end of usage, and a shame to ourselves as a country. Almost 25% of the population is prescribed methadone daily, and we've got more grandparents becoming parents again, looking after their own children and their children's children. I'm afraid I'm short of time. So there is something to be done here. There is a challenge to be met. Now, the notion that... I'll take the
Stuart Stevenson. Just could he clarify that he really meant 25% of the overall population, because that's what we had.
Yes. The statistics that I received from Plenary prison and seem to be reflect, if I can finish, and seem to reflect the experience in other prisons too, talk about somewhere in excess of 22% of prisoners accessing methadone. So in itself, in completing my presentation, I've no doubt that those providing services and care, including the doctors and chemists, are deeply committed to improving the situation. But they need leadership from the government, they need direction in terms of the strategic plan, and they need strength placed in the implementation. The government continues to suggest after 5 years they have insufficient statistics, and that they're up against it when they try to work out where they should invest in things that work. It seems content to allow our prison population to queue daily for access to drug treatments, and it's satisfied that 80% of them will leave prison on exactly the same dose of methadone as when they entered.
Okay, this will be closing now, please.
The last paragraph, the strategy as envisaged, properly directed, would help bring those who want to be rehabilitated support My comments do not undermine the strategy. They call for the government to get real about the drug problem and shift the scarce resources to the solutions that are shown to work and work effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Brian Adam to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I suppose I should declare an interest in that in a previous life I not only monitored those who were addicted to a variety of drugs, but also dealt with the forensic work associated with those who died. Having put that to one side, I note the advice we all received that we should ignore the controversies and that there's no need for them to continue. Of course, the controversies are around substitutes for heroin and also about harm reduction. But not only did we buy in collectively to the strategy, but most importantly, professionals, SDF, and those alcohol and drug partnerships bought in to the strategy, which has delivered already some improvements. And the most important people in this equation are not us. In fact, not even the professionals. It is the addicts and their families willing to come forward to get treatment. In terms of the debate around substitution, there are some advocates of buprenorphine, some advocates of methadone, and the debate about whether harm reduction is a worthwhile goal in itself. Well, I think that those are important debates, and I don't think that we know. And some of the reason we don't know is the lack of data. And I hope that, as part of the review, improvements in data collection will result. But in terms of the harm reduction, of course, harm reduction is worthwhile. Any diminution in the blood-borne virus spread benefits everybody. But it is not the end. It has to be recovery, because getting on an opiate substitute is not the same as being on the road to recovery. Now, I commend the government for its investment in both in bricks and mortar and in services. And indeed, in the North East, we've been very fortunate to have the timber market development, which takes to the stage of follow-through, not just immediate rehab, but dealing with all the ongoing problems. And I'm absolutely delighted that the waiting list effectively has been eliminated. Now, Dr. Simpson has cast some doubts as to whether this is the reality. But it's certainly the reality in the North East that there has been a significant change. And I think we all endorse the idea that there should be a whole person approach, not just the immediate addiction problems, but the housing problems, the employment problems. All of these are important. And it's important that we deliver that support. In terms of the road to recovery, I hope we can continue to maintain unity of purpose here. And I commend those professionals for accepting the difficult policy that is contained within the strategy and for actually carrying out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now call on Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Duncan McNeill.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I welcome today's debate? I think it's very helpful to have this update on the Road to Recovery drug strategy. This is clearly an issue that affects communities in all of our constituencies. I think the Minister was absolutely right to highlight the cross-party support for these efforts. I think it's important, though, to place the debate in some context. We have seen over the past number of years investment in trying to deal with this problem from the Scottish Government. Indeed, in this year alone, we have seen the Scottish Government investing £28.6 million for frontline drug treatment and recovery services, which is an increase of some 20% since 2006-07. And of course, we've seen the creation of the 30 alcohol and drug partnerships, which are doing good work within local communities. And indeed, the one that relates to my own constituency, Lanarkshire ADP, is doing particularly good work, because in Lanarkshire we've seen the drug waiting times target met for 2013. And I think it was also important to highlight that in Lanarkshire, because I think there is this idea that everyone in treatment is on the methadone programme. That's not the case. It was a point well made by the Minister. In Lanarkshire, there's quite a variety of treatment, with some 25% of people on drug treatments for addiction being prescribed Suboxone. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, President Officer, but hopefully I've done it some justice. Can I also focus on some of the outcomes, because it's important to look at the outcomes, and because we can measure some of the outcomes, I think it's wrong to suggest that we don't have any information about what is happening on the ground. We can see that progress has been made. Drug use is falling. We have seen the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey published earlier this year, showing a decrease in the number of adults reporting that they had used any illicit drug in the last year. It fell to 6.6% from 7.2% in 2010 and 7.6% in 2008-09, and also demonstrated that fewer young people are taking drugs. That's clearly still too many people taking substances, but I think the reduction has to be welcomed, and I think it does give lie to any suggestion that the problem is getting worse and worse, as I think was suggested earlier. Briefly.
Margaret MacDonald.
I thank the member. Over these last statistics, there may well have been some confusion in some people's mind because of the confusion there was in England about when it was legal and when it was not legal to take cannabis, for example.
Okay, Jamie Hepburn.
I think that's a fair point, and it's well made, and it's now on the record. And of course, we know that waiting times are down as well. The government set a target that by March 2013, 90% of clients would wait no longer than 3 weeks from a referral received to appropriate drug or alcohol treatment. And I think, of course, it's important to emphasise that this is drug and alcohol treatment. There can't be many families in Scotland not affected by either drugs or particularly alcohol abuse in one way or another. And we know that this target's been met ahead of time. And indeed, in the NHS Lanarkshire area, 99.9% of those were treated within that time frame. And that's a huge achievement for those working in the field, and it should surely be welcomed by all. And I also think it's interesting that we see there is innovation in this programme as well, because the naloxone programme, again, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, naloxone, thank you very much, Minister, was introduced. We know that 3,445 kits were issued in 2011-12, and that is a programme that, of course, has the potential to save lives. I would refer to a briefing by the Scottish Drugs Forum. They particularly welcome this initiative, and what they're actually saying is that it should go further. They say that barriers to its expansion must be identified and dismantled, so it'll be interesting to see how the review looks at that particular matter. Can I want to turn in the time I have left, Presiding Officer, to this issue that's been raised about the idea that pharmacists are somehow profiteering. I want to deal with it gently because I think this has been a consensual debate. I don't want to turn it into a point-scoring exercise, but I want to refer to a briefing by the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. And in their briefing, they say quite clearly, dispensing high volumes of methadone is not a route to easy riches. It is normally undertaken by individual pharmacists with a deep commitment to helping some of the most unfortunate people in our country. I agree very much with Willie Rennie. I think it ill behoves anyone to suggest that pharmacists have any other motivation than that set out in the Royal Pharmaceutical Society's briefing. And can I gently suggest that if the big solution to Scotland's drug problem is the introduction of a uniform payment to pharmacists for the delivery of the methadone programme, I think we'd be living in a far easier world than we actually inhabit. I think it was a bit of a strange contribution to this serious debate. Can I just conclude, Presiding Officer, because I think I want to very strongly welcome the fact that the Chief Medical Officer will now be reviewing the strategy. I want to just introduce in the last 30 seconds I have the NSPCC Scotland briefing pointed out that they would like to see, and I'd be interested to hear the response to this Minister, that in any review that it is vital that any alternative treatment options facilitate early identification and whole assessment to identify and prevent harm to dependent children. A point again made by the Scottish Drugs Forum. I hope that can be viewed as a positive contribution. I'd be interested to hear the Minister's response to that, and can I welcome today's debate, Presiding Officer.
Well done. Thank you very much. Now calling Duncan McNeill to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Presiding Officer, and again I give notice at this time we've not got the time to take interventions. I want to make a number of points. I think the consensus in this chamber and over time is that we have got a very challenging problem that has confronted previous governments, previous administrations and indeed governments all over the world. And we hear the Minister's justifiable claims for improvement and investment. Here today we have also, I think, have to recognise that the strategy has serious challenges. And the other point I need to make, that hasn't been made too much, is that this is not just an issue for the addicts themselves. The families, the communities that live with this problem should not be forgotten. The enforcement aspects of this cannot be forgotten. We have low seizures of heroin in this country, and I think that's an indication of where more work can be done. There is also genuine worries about the increase of cocaine. There's also the widespread recent evidence of the widespread use of so-called legal high drugs, and more evidence coming forward about the long-term harmful effects of using cannabis. And we shouldn't forget that. Obviously, one of the focuses here today is that drug deaths in Scotland are at a 10-year high, almost as high or higher than any other European country. And tragically, in my constituency, we have had an increase of problem drug users since 2006 of 600 to the current estimate of 1,400 problem drug users. And this is something that I haven't just raised today, and I've had the opportunity to discuss last year with the Minister. The peak that we had last year with drug deaths, and again the 20 deaths that we faced this year was tragedies all over. And if we can't conclude, at least, or concede that methadone and topping up with methadone is a high-risk activity, and it should be recognised as that, because in over 50% of those local deaths in Inverclyde, methadone was an issue, and topping up with that needs to be recognised as a high-risk activity, and we need to take measures to deal with some of that. But we're not talking about the investment, we're not talking about the strategy, we're talking about outcomes today. And while the focus of the strategy is very clear on the benefits and focus of recovery, we still don't know how many drug users are being described, methadone across Scotland. How many are leaving the programme drug-free, or how long have they been on the programme? There are no benchmarks for recovery based on the drug strategy, so we have no way of knowing how far down the road the recovery we are, or how far there is to go before the goal of recovery-focused treatment for all drug users are being realised. And until we do that and get those benchmarks, until we do that, we cannot get to a stage of examining what works and what doesn't work, and we haven't got those benchmarks. But we also have to recognise that for those 60,000 drug users that were mentioned by Willie Rennie, they are not all recoverable. It's a horrible and hard thing to say. But there are some people who take drugs because they enjoy them. And they're of a particular age group, and they will continue to take drugs and the top-up of methadone. That's a tragic reality. And we need to face up to a situation that there are another group, or the grandparents have been mentioned. The grandparents are now been heroin users for many, many years. And they're taking drugs now just to feel normal. Not to socialise, not to have a party time or whatever, but just to feel normal. And it's unlikely that we'll move them on. And some radical strategies probably need to be applied to that group alone. But that group that are not interested, not committed to recovery, are using money, expending money, soaking up money that could be used to support those who are committed to the programme. And we cannot ignore that. That's one of the issues that we need to face up to. And I believe that we need to test that commitment. I believe that people on the methadone programme should be tested on a regular basis for topping up with methadone. I do believe that. To identify their commitment, to keep them safe, and to ensure they're on the programme. And if they are not complying with that programme, they are not committed to recovery, then appropriate action needs to be taken. If they're not committed to the programme, we cannot extend that commitment, because there are precious resources here that need to be shifted across to ensure that those who are committed to recovery get the best of treatment, to ensure the best opportunity for that recovery. And I hope that the Minister, who is not in a place, will read the report and will take some of those ideas on and feed them in to the review of this strategy that is now underway. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Dennis Robertson to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, can I start off by congratulating the many, many hundreds of people working in the road to recovery. The many hundreds of people who quite often are volunteers and are carers, and quite often are people on that road to recovery or who have indeed recovered. Can I also associate myself, Presiding Officer, with the comments of Willie Rennie? I think Willie Rennie moved this debate forward from statistics to people, as did George Adam. Annabel Goldie said, "We are on a difficult road, but at least we're on the road." And we are. Presiding Officer, Jenny Mara said that maybe the key to recovery, and I apologise, Ms Mara, if I'm misquoting you, is residential. Presiding Officer, I fully believe the key is an individual-centred, person-centred approach. Yeah. It's a holistic approach. It's the individual. And the treatment for one person may not be the treatment for the next.
Well said.
Presiding Officer. Absolutely.
Nimara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank the member for taking the intervention. I would have to go back to the exact words I used. I don't think I said it was key. I think there should be a mix of programmes best suited to the person, a mix of methadone use and residential rehabilitation. But the reality is that residential rehabilitation in our country today is vastly underused with empty beds.
Thank you, Mr Robertson, 4 minutes, 20 seconds.
Thank you. I thank Ms Mara. Ms Mara, I'm sorry, maybe the official record will show, but I believe that I think you did say key, but I stand to be corrected. Presiding Officer, I was involved many years ago when I was a member of a crime prevention partnership in taking information to schools, teachers and parents of trying to look at ways of avoiding children and young people getting involved with any kind of addiction, whether it be solvents, drugs or alcohol. And this road to recovery, the strategy, is the right one. Presiding Officer, in my social work days, I had probably one of the most saddest cases I think I ever had to work with. And it was a young woman who had a one-year-old child. And the young woman in question was a drug addict, and she was also alcoholic. She wanted to look after her child, but she didn't have the ability to look after her child. She wanted to go onto a programme, and she was admitted to a programme because she felt, as a young mum, she wanted to try and ensure that she was going to be the right mum for bringing up her child. When she came off the programme, she was fine for months, absolutely. But then the need for the addictive aspect of the alcohol and drugs was too great for her. She then approached the social work department, and I was a key worker at the time. And the sad thing is that she wanted to give up her child, her son, to go back on to the road of destruction in her life. But I suppose in some respects, Presiding Officer, she was showing the love she had for her son and knowing that the addiction she had was too great. So therefore, at least she felt she was doing the right thing for her son. That one-year-old is now a young man, and unfortunately, that young woman is no longer with us. Presiding Officer, it is people. And each individual, whether or not, Presiding Officer, they have the willingness to go onto this road to recovery or not, we've got to take them as an individual, a person, a human being. And what we look for, Presiding Officer, is the partnership approach. And the partnership approach is working. And Presiding Officer, that means that the partnership is with housing. It's with the Job Centre Plus. It's with all the organisations that are out there to try and aid that recovery process. Presiding Officer, we cannot turn our back on any single person with an addiction. We are there, and we should be responsible as a society to try and ensure that they get the best help possible. And that is why, Presiding Officer, I firmly believe that we should be doing more to link our addiction to our mental health strategies as well. A lot of people with addiction do have very serious and complicated mental health problems. Presiding Officer, I would like to see that strategy look at that in a much more holistic process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I often, when I speak in the Chamber, refer back to the period I spent as a local councillor in Aberdeen, and members will forgive me if I do so again, because one of the developments which was delivered during my time as a councillor was the Timmer Market Clinic in Aberdeen. It's the first purpose-built one-stop centre in Scotland for people with drug misuse problems. It was funded by a collaboration between the City Council, NHS Grampian and the Scottish Government. It's a facility which has around 20 rooms used for consulting and treatment, office accommodation, meeting rooms, waiting and play areas for patients and their children, and also has a courtyard garden. And working there are a team of around 30 individuals, including doctors, nurses, social workers, rehabilitation workers and admin staff, who deliver an intensive 16-week programme from the premises when patients first come into treatment services following GP referral. Over the first 6 months, over 450 patients used the Timmer Market Clinic, and I think it has been an extremely successful part of the drug treatment landscape, particularly in the North East. But I think it is something which I'm sure the Government will be looking at as an option that could potentially be replicated elsewhere. I've spoken with local drugs workers in the North East and listened very carefully to what they've had to say in relation to the road to recovery. The first thing to note is that there is a degree of delight out there that we now have a drug strategy tailored towards recovery, a clear focus on recovery, and providing much needed leadership. There is also great delight out there at the
strong improvements we've seen in terms of waiting times. In Aberdeenshire, one of the areas which I represent within the North East, there are 1,400 or so drug addicts, around 60% of whom are currently engaged in some form of rehabilitation or treatment scheme. With relation to the difficulties and stigmas that there are, I think one of the problems that we often face is that there is often a difficulty around self-definition of problem drug users. I think Willie Rennie highlighted, and I think quite correctly highlighted, some of those users who find themselves at the lower end of the income scale. But I think Margot MacDonald's point was quite right, that there is a group out there who are problem drug users but don't see themselves as problem drug users. Those individuals with high disposable incomes who perhaps are using specific types of drugs in what they see as a recreational way, but who are nonetheless would be categorised as problem drug users but don't self-identify in that respect. And we have an issue around how we address that, and I think that's something which I'm sure the Minister is very clearly focused on. We also have the emerging problems. Just 1 second, Mr Robertson, I just finished. We also have the emerging problem around the emergence of legal highs and the difficulties that is causing both for the justice system but also for the treatment system. And I'll take an intervention from Mr Robertson.
Very quickly, thank you, Presiding Officer. Mr MacDonald, my understanding is that about 48% of crack cocaine users are now in the Grampian area. Would that probably ally to the fact that perhaps it's people with more disposable income?
I think that is part of the problem, and I think there is a very complex landscape out there in terms of drug addiction. I think we're talking here about individuals and often about families as well, and the key in all of this, I think, is to strike a note of caution. We, as members of the Scottish Parliament, hold a very privileged position and are able to speak on a range of issues out there, and we must be careful and cautious in the language that we deploy when talking about issues such as drug abuse and drug misuse, because we are the ones who should be more careful in that regard about the stigma that is often attached to the words and the language that we use. And we have seen, I think, unfortunate headlines in the recent past around things like, for example, needle exchange, which has a great benefit in terms of preventing the transmission of blood-borne viruses such as HIV, such as hepatitis. We've seen some unfortunate headlines around the methadone programme, and I think it's worth highlighting again that less than 1/5 of those who are currently in treatment are on some form of drug replacement, and within that drug replacement is methadone. So it's not the huge numbers that one might assume, and we also must be very careful about a negative stigmatisation of the methadone programme, a broad-brush negative stigmatisation, which I think we've seen in some headlines, because that will only be detrimental in terms of getting people who could potentially have their lives stabilised through methadone to continue using that and continue with that programme. And recovery will differ for individuals. It differs on an individual-by-individual basis. Circumstances, as Willie Rennie highlighted, that need to be tackled alongside this are things like homelessness, are things like deprivation, are things like the chaotic lifestyles that many people face. And it's worth noting again, Presiding Officer, that we are talking about ordinary people here. I could bring in my school yearbook and point to people in that yearbook who are now addicted to drugs. Many of us will know people who we either grew up with or who our families grew up with who are now addicted to drugs. And we must be very careful about the kind of language we use, the kind of stigmatisation that can arise from that language, and the difficulties that can then cause for those individuals who we are trying to help to recover, because these are the people who matter most.
Thank you very much. Now calling Mary Fee, to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In recent months, figures have been released from the Government and other leading experts in drug policy that have given us all food for thought. According to last month's Holyrood magazine, 59,600 people in Scotland are problem drug users, and that's twice the prevalence compared to England and Wales. And in Scotland, 53% of problem drug users are not currently receiving treatment, compared to just 33% in England and Wales. And a staggering 24,500 people are now on the Government's methadone programme. And it was revealed last month, and it's already been mentioned today, that methadone has been implicated in 275 drug-related deaths out of 584. Methadone being prescribed as a substitute to heroin and other drugs so that the patient can wean themselves off all illicit drugs and start the recovery process. However, this is not the case, and many are using methadone as a top-up drug to those already taken. And I understand that methadone can have a stabilising influence on people's lives. However, there have been reports of some programme users being on methadone for up to 10 years. And there is now a culture of long-term methadone use which creates a psychological dependency which can be more controlling than any substance. And methadone needs to be a programme of stabilisation and detox with a view to moving towards abstinence. And it was also reported by the BBC in 2010 that some methadone users have been spitting out their methadone to resell, and the practice known as spit meth helps addicts pay for heroin. The failing of the methadone programme is not the only problem with the government's drug strategy. It was announced only at the weekend that the Scottish Recovery Consortium has called a meeting to discuss the issue of residential rehab. And again, it's been mentioned this afternoon that some rehab centres are only at half capacity, and Beechwood House in Inverness is only at 40%. And I recently had the privilege of spending a day with the people from the 218 Centre in Glasgow, and again, that's already been mentioned today. And I can only commend the 218 Centre for the excellent work they do and the lives that they save. The government strategy clearly has its failings, and after 4 years, it's now time for another approach. The Scottish Recovery Consortium have had their funding cut by more than a third in 2 years, from £398,000 in 2010-11 to just £262,745 for 2012-13. And before the SNP came to power, they were quick to criticise the previous administration's perceived lack of effort in tackling Scotland's drug problem. And it was good to see that a comprehensive drug strategy was published by the Scottish Government a year after they came to power. However, we need innovative approaches. I've got a lot to get through. If I've got time, I'll come back to you, Mr MacDonald. We need innovative approaches if we are to, once and for all, finally tackle the drug problem that we have. There must be cross-party approach to tackling drug problems. And the rise of new party drugs or legal highs is changing the drugs market too quickly for the methods we have at our disposal to control drugs and treat drug misuse. And, Presiding Officer, while I applaud the Scottish Government and the NHS for meeting the 3-week waiting time target ahead of schedule, I still feel that 3 weeks is too long for very vulnerable people who have identified a need for help to have to wait for treatment. 3 weeks can make a huge difference in a drug user's life. Treatment should be at the point of need if somebody is going to tackle addiction, and that treatment and support should remain in place and not be interrupted throughout the entire recovery process. Drug policy does not take into account the different reasons that people take drugs and become addicted. Drug problems now need to be seen and addressed within their wider social and economic context. Entrenched drug problems appear to be significantly linked to inequality and social exclusion. Too many homes and communities are being devastated by drugs, and we cannot support only the drug user, we need to support the community. For example, sending drug users to prison removes them from their social and family environment. That individual is then reformed and stays clean for the 6 months of their sentence. They are then put straight back into their social and family environment where they took drugs in the first place. And we need to support people and families long term, or we will never solve the revolving door of drug users and reoffending. I'm sorry, I've not got time. I'm really sorry. As is widely known, recovery differs between individuals. To support recovery, a wide range of treatment, mutual aid and local-based community approaches are required. One key factor that needs to be taken into account in any rehabilitative programme is the role of family support. People with drug problems are more likely to achieve recovery if they have a family that is supportive and has support for them. The involvement of adult family members of people with drug problems can promote recovery for their drug-using relative, but they also need support in their own right. The UK Drug Policy Commission estimates that over 1.4 million people in the UK were adversely affected by their relatives' drug use. The impact can also spread more widely, affecting family members' employment, their social lives and relationships and family finances. Also, working closely with local authorities in COSLA should be seen as a unique opportunity for local approaches which can set single outcomes and be properly evaluated. Finally, Presiding Officer,
Drawing to a close, please.
We need to look at what works in the world of rehabilitation and get rid of what doesn't. We need to fight for decent housing and work opportunities that can enable individual recovery and improve society.
Thanks so much. Now calling Jim Eady to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, we need a mature and informed debate about drug use in this country. Service users and their families and those who work in the field do not want drugs policy to become a political football. They want policy stability, they want national leadership, and they want grassroots involvement that allows for genuine engagement and empowerment on the part of individuals seeking recovery and the communities in which they live. Now, we are debating the national strategy, the road to recovery. And the first thing to say, surely, is that recovery does not equal abstinence. A point, I think, which was made and articulated well by Annabel Goldie in her speech. The artificial distinction between harm reduction and abstinence is one that has been highlighted by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which said there is no contradiction between treatment and prevention on the one hand and reducing the adverse health and social consequences of drug use on the other. And as it states, this is a false dichotomy. They are complementary. Now, the road to recovery also made it clear that people should decide on what constitutes their own recovery. People speak of the methadone programme as if it is the same across the whole of Scotland. It is not. The quality can vary from place to place, as can the resources dedicated to the programme. However, despite negative media coverage, much of it in the run-up to this debate, the fact remains that many people and their families benefit greatly from a period on a methadone programme. Now, the director of the Scottish Recovery Consortium, Cuala Darani, who was the driving force behind a thriving service user-led recovery movement in Glasgow, put it well when she said, "We are grateful for a policy that recognises diversity of recovery paths and acknowledges the importance of the lived experience of recovery." Brian Adams spoke about the role of healthcare professionals within the strategy. And Jamie Hepburn spoke about alcohol and drug partnerships and the delivery of outcomes. ADPs need to demonstrate progress in terms of outcomes for those affected by substance use. It is important to make sure that national outcomes are agreed on and that we are measuring relevant indicators which demonstrate the achievement of these outcomes. Now, in an excellent speech, Willie Rennie reminded us that everyone deserves a chance or a second chance and that there are different routes to recovery. He also reminded us too about the fact that many of the people we are talking about have underlying mental health and social problems. But the important point, surely, is that there are a range of services to which people with problem drug use need access in order to remove obstacles to recovery. Dennis Robertson spoke movingly about the human experience, and George Adam told us about the importance of recovery in ensuring people can be contributing members of society.
Jenny Mara? Could I have Jenny Mara's mic?
Would the member agree with me that if the diversity of treatment approaches is key to this, and I would agree with him, why there are no residential rehabilitation centres in Dundee, which has such a significant problem with drugs?
Jenny, do?
I will not speak about Dundee. I do recognise the point that Ms Mara made earlier in her contribution that there is use of residential services, but I do not recognise her description that the drug strategy is unravelling, and I don't think that people in the field will recognise it either. Now, as an Edinburgh MSP, I have no problem in acknowledging the pioneering work undertaken by services across the country. And in this point, I would say that we as a Parliament should be proud of the many good projects that exist across Scotland. In my own city of Edinburgh, there are some excellent examples of good practice. The Recovery Hub, which acts as a one-stop shop, provides a range of support services for people with problems associated with alcohol or drugs and supports those people on their recovery journey. Now, reference has been made by Richard Simpson and others to drug deaths. And I think Mr Simpson's suggestion of an NHS pilot, perhaps under the supervision of a pharmacist prescriber, is one that is worthy of consideration. Now, research recently conducted in deprived areas in the east of Glasgow shows that people on a good methadone programme are 8 times less likely to die than people who are not on the programme. Also, 50% of drug deaths involved methadone that had not been prescribed methadone. This illegal redistribution of methadone is what is referred to as leakage. The issue is complex and there may be a number of factors. A possible lack of supervised dispensing, allowing for illegal redistribution. There may be no proper care plan agreement in place with GP buy-in and appropriate supervision. The user may not be being prescribed the most appropriate dosage, which may lead to the person taking illegal drugs as well as methadone. These conditions often lead to the dangerous practice of poly-drug use, where people take other illegal drugs along with their methadone prescription. Now, being drug-free is not the only positive recovery outcome. Keeping people alive, as some of the earlier speakers said, on methadone, who might otherwise die from illegal drug use, is surely a positive outcome as well. There have been calls for time-limited programmes, but in fact there is no evidence anywhere in the world that such an approach would be successful, and indeed the originators of methadone maintenance treatment did not envisage people being drug-free after 2 years or so, but envisaged a long-term programme with appropriate support. This does not mean that we need to expect everyone to be on long-term prescribing, and it is true that some people may only require a short period of methadone treatment. People can become drug-free with fantastic outcomes, but it requires a broad range of support. What is important is that people are empowered to decide their own recovery.
Thank you very much. I now call Neil Findlay to be followed by John Mason.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. This is a very important debate because it's about people's lives. It's also about community cohesion and sustainability. And it goes to the very heart of how we deal with one of the greatest concerns for any parent, relative or friend, namely how we assist those closest to us if they become ensnared in drugs and the world that serious drugs use drags them into. We've heard there's an estimated 60,000 problem drug users in Scotland, and almost 600 deaths have occurred as a result of drugs. And these deaths, we shouldn't forget, have left families without a father or a son, a mother or a daughter. And if we put that into perspective, look around this chamber at decision time. It's the equivalent of 5 of each and every one of us dead because of drugs or a combination of drugs and alcohol. For 6 years I worked as a frontline housing officer, and in that role I saw the multiplicity of ways in which drugs destroyed not just individuals but community well-being. And whether it was the elderly neighbour living in fear, or the resentment at dealers showing off their ostentatious lifestyles with no apparent job to sustain it, or the health concerns about people who were visibly in decline, or the anger at housing allocations policies, or inter-dealer violence, or just a simple thing like the dread of parents keeping their children in because they feared them going out in the streets. These were the concerns that people relayed to me and the housing association and councils that I worked for. And let us be absolutely in no doubt, drug abuse is inextricably linked to poverty. The impact of drugs falls disproportionately, although Margot MacDonald's right, not exclusively on poorer working-class communities, but it is they who suffer most from the health impacts of drugs, but also from the associated crime, the antisocial behaviour, violence, fear, loan sharking, and the accompanying threats and intimidation. The Scottish Drugs Forum recognised the complex picture of drugs use in 2007 when they stated there are strong links between poverty, deprivation and widening inequalities in problem drug use. And a Scottish Parliament committee in 2000 noted that deprived communities with poor housing, poor amenities, high levels of unemployment were the areas most seriously affected by drugs misuse. This should be no surprise to any of us. Deindustrialisation created the conditions in which drugs can thrive. In former mining communities like where I live, or large city housing schemes, our people have suffered horrendously over the decades as drugs filled the gaps that was once occupied by a job and the social discipline and positive influences that came with it. And today, as we see youth unemployment rising, benefits being cut and the impacts of austerity biting in these very same communities, I fear that rather than tackling deprivation, we may be creating the conditions that could lead to a new cycle of drugs abuse. So, Presiding Officer, I would echo the comments made by the Scottish Drugs Forum in 2006 when they said they wanted
and I quote, "now and in the future to see deprivation given its full and proper place in all considerations of drug prevention policy at both local and strategic levels, and not let that slip from sight. I fear it may well be." The greatest alternative that we can offer to a life of involvement in drugs is hope, giving people an education, the hope of a job, a caring and supportive community, and if we do that, they will have alternatives. The road to recovery policy is a holistic approach with, I think we would all agree, sound motivations, and it's not by accident that it enjoyed cross-party support. And it has led to some good initiatives, and people have mentioned the introduction of naloxone, and I think that's seen as a model of good practice. There are also calls for a need to improve coordinated work, for example, between child welfare organisations, mental health services and addiction services, and that is right. And indeed, the Education Committee, in which I sit, is currently having an inquiry into children in care, and we are looking at these very issues. In terms of treatment, the picture appears to be mixed, with waiting times for those seeking treatment appear to be reducing, but there has also been, as has been mentioned, a reduction in residential care treatment places. And I believe that any harm reduction strategies and abstinence approaches have to be tailored to meet each patient, and I think there is general agreement on that also. Finally, Presiding Officer, all of the treatments that are used and applied must go hand in hand with the fight against organised crime. In my local area, there's been a very innovative multi-agency approach called Operation Focus, designed to eradicate organised crime. And it's used already gathered intelligence to act in one swoop to take dealers out of the community. The way it works is that houses are targeted and raided, with workmen on standby to immediately follow up and carry out repairs to the properties. They then sweep the streets and clean up the area, both physically and metaphorically. And police officers are then on the streets in high visibility patrols for the following couple of weeks. GPs and pharmacies are put on standby because supply is taken off the streets, and schools are visited by police officers who reassure the pupils what has just happened. And recently in one school, they left to a standing ovation from the young people at the assembly. This is a complex issue, and I think we're doing it justice today.
Thank you very much. I call John Mason, to be followed by Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Clearly, drugs is a less common problem than alcohol, but clearly still very serious. 584 drug-related deaths in 2011 is a pretty sobering statistic, and Glasgow clearly has a worse problem than the rest of Scotland. I think it's clear from today's debate that there are different approaches that are suitable for different people. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and I believe that's why the Road to Recovery programme has been such a big step in the right direction. In the East End of Glasgow, quite some years ago, Glasgow Carlton Athletic and David Bryce won a lot of respect for their approach to dealing with helping drug addicts. Their approach was zero tolerance, with an emphasis on sport and fitness and in the drug addicts' lives. And he was a former drug addict himself, David Bryce. I think there was a lot of criticism of him at the time. It was a slightly different approach from what Glasgow was doing generally, and there was quite a lot of clashes with the public agencies. But I think it seems like maybe he was a forerunner of some of the things that we're doing now, and I think he talked a lot of sense. I mean, incidentally, on a lighter note, in the 2008 by-election, the Deputy Presiding Officer and myself met up with some of the recovering addicts who were heavily engaged in football, and it has to be said that all of them and the Deputy First Minister were better at football than I was. Another approach is zero tolerance, but linked in with a religious emphasis, and there are a number of groups, both in Scotland and overseas, who have done that. And again, that is not appropriate perhaps for everybody, but is for some. And a book that I read years ago that still sticks in my mind was when Jackie Pullinger went to Hong Kong and worked with the drug addicts there, as recounted in her book, Chasing the Dragon. But thirdly, another possibility, of course, is that for some people methadone is the right and is the helpful approach to take, as long as it is part of an overall treatment package. Some years ago, when I was a councillor in Glasgow, there was a lot of criticism of the methadone programme at that time, because so many of the users were not getting any treatment or support apart from that. And I think it seems to me there has been a huge change since then. And it's interesting to note the figure, yes.
Jimmy Day. Mr Gady, you need to speak to your microphone.
Thank the member for taking an intervention. Will he take from me as a an Edinburgh MSP to Glasgow MSP my thanks and appreciation for Glasgow Addiction Services in pioneering a treatment approach which is annexed in the Road to Recovery, which shows that where you have a person on a methadone programme, you have buy-in from the service user themselves, the pharmacist, the doctor, and an addiction worker or a nurse, and that programme works very well. And in that sense, Glasgow Addiction Services have been leading the way for the rest of Scotland.
John Mason.
Yes, I'm happy to pass that on as and when I get the opportunity. And I think the point about joined-up approach is very important. I was just going to actually touch on that, and Christine Graham had also mentioned that in her approach. And I remember David Crawford, who's just currently about retiring from Glasgow City Council in charge of social work. I was at his interview some years ago, and he was currently at that stage working for Renfrewshire. And in fact, Glasgow, I think, recognised that Renfrewshire was doing something better, in that when the police were involved in a drugs case and they found children in the household, they immediately referred them to social work, and that had not been happening in Glasgow at that time. So I think we can learn from each other, and that's an extremely good lesson. In Glasgow, I was given the report this came out last month, I think, from the Glasgow City Alcohol and Drug Partnership, and specifically referring to Glasgow Community and Safety Services, which was actually a quote from them. And I'll just read a little bit of it, but it says, "This year we've seen the establishment of various recovery cafes across the city, 120 supporters of recovery taking part in the Great Scottish Run, numerous conversation cafes taking place, and recovery groups becoming key to planning and delivering events at Grand Week 2012. So I think there is quite a lot of positive things we can take. And the joined-up approach too in relation to pharmacies, George Adam already referred to that. And I think sometimes there has been a bit of a public reaction against drug addicts hanging around pharmacies, perhaps, and when a new pharmacy is proposed, as one was recently in my constituency, people are asking if methadone will be dispensed. But again, I think there has been quite a lot of improvement in recent years. Over the summer, I was in visiting a pharmacy in Shettleston, which happened to be part of the co-op. And I must say I was very impressed. And I think that perhaps the one thing that impressed me most, apart from the much better facilities than they used to have, was the personal relationship that the pharmacist can have with any kind of patient, actually, but certainly including those using methadone. Because whereas a GP very often has extremely limited time, it is possible for the pharmacist to build up a really good knowledge of the patient. And if there's a fluctuation from day to day or week to week or month to month, that can be picked up quite quickly. Just very finally and quickly, when I was at Westminster, there was the suggestion in the previous welfare reform that treatment should be compulsory and people's benefits should be cancelled if they did not take part in treatment. And I must say and I think the Scottish Government of the time, and I assume the whole Scottish Parliament, were strongly opposed to that and would oppose it in the future, because if you take benefits away from folk or enforce treatment, it's the kids who are going to be damaged, it's the grandparents who are going to have to pay the bills. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As previously notified, I can give Margaret MacDonald 3 minutes, which would allow me to give John Finney 3 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate the Government on the road to recovery, but say that I think it's work in progress, because there is still the faint echo of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No, which has bedevilled the drugs policies that we've had here for the last 40 years. I was the chairman of the Drugs Forum in the late 80s, and when I saw the number of deaths that there were in Scotland last year, I honestly questioned how much advance we had made. I've come down to thinking that we've got to learn to live with drugs. As Duncan McNeill said, some folk will continue to take drugs no matter what you do with them, and you have to accept that there's never going to be 100% acceptance of any programme that you put in front of people. The other thing I wanted to mention just before I move on is that I don't think that the pharmacists who are dispensing methadone should be demonised the way they were in some respects. And I think also we've got to remember, Jenny's not here Jenny Mara isn't here to hear it, but there is a logical explanation as to why a small pharmacist wouldn't spend as proportionately as much of the time, even if he did have the personal relationships and dispensing that John Mason spoke of. But you go to the larger pharmacist and it's eating into their time. So you're displacing business, you've really got to compensate them in some ways. I think it's perfectly reasonable that you should have different payments, but that is a personal opinion. And here's another personal opinion coming. As well as living with drugs, I think that we should use everything we can to bring all the influence we have, all the pressure we have, to bear on London. After we've done what Richard Simpson suggested, and I suggested in the very first Parliament when we came in here, and that is run our own pilot study to discover what we need to discover about drug use in Scotland. Who uses it, when they use it, why they use it, with whom do they use it? Why do most people who start taking cannabis before they're 16 or 17 stop by the time they're 32 or something? And of course, we know what the answer is. They can afford to get a good whisky then. But we should admit the fact that there's a great deal that we could do as regards the classification of the drugs. It's now far too old-fashioned. Should cannabis still be classified? I doubt it. Heroin should go through a medical route. I'm absolutely sure of that. But we can start putting pressure on London after we've got the information that comes from evidence. I thank you for the time, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I now call John Finney, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This motion for me is about people, and it's about their individual needs, and these needs should be assessed and wherever met. And if that's done on a regular basis, then the issues that have been alluded to, particularly by Duncan McNeill, should be picked up on. I think this has been a very useful debate. I think any fixation with methadone is less than helpful. We heard from the Minister right at the outset of some of the benefits, and I certainly know of individuals who have gone through programmes who are leading very positive lifestyles. Can I also express my pleasure that the motion pays a tribute to addiction workers, because they have a very testing job, and as we heard from the briefing from the Scottish Drugs Forum, the long-lasting therapeutic relationship is key, and these people, many of whom are above and beyond the call of the duty with the way they treat their clients, not only get the client across the door, but retain them there, and that's very, very important. Harm reduction seems to be used as a negative by some people, but to me it's a very positive thing, and we've heard in relation to needle and syringe exchange, the benefits aren't just for the individual, they're also for the family, friend and the wider community, indeed with hepatitis C, the HIV. I'd like to touch on a couple of issues I don't know if anyone else has picked up, and I didn't note that they did, and that's one about drug warnings. We had a series of tragic deaths in the Highlands, and it's my understanding that drug users have extensive knowledge, not just of market availability, but market strength, and they also know the very clear sequence and taking of substances to get them where they want to go and get them back down again. So the drug deaths are very complicated. Often cocktails has been the phrase used. And sensationalism doesn't help. Drug warnings do help, and I'm aware of the frustration that what was a logjam between the agencies about putting information out. So if I indeed asked parliamentary question on that subject, no one will be sued to say there may be difficult things out there. It's a bit like an avalanche warning. Anyone will tell you it's unsafe to go up a hill. No one will tell you it's safe to go up in the winter. There'll be no avalanche threat if there's heavy snow. So I think we need to address the issue of that. Also legal highs. I raised that issue with the police and they told me they had no intelligence. So I gave them names, location, car numbers, and I would encourage everyone else to do that, because they invariably are linked to the issues of controlled drugs. Neil Findlay's point about the housing, I think that is absolutely key in the link to poverty there, and to realise who we are serving. There are wider implications from putting drug users into communities where they're ill-equipped themselves to deal with the situations that they're confronted with, whether it be doorkeeping. Naloxone, in the 15 seconds left, naloxone saves lives. It's a very simple message. I welcome the rollout. I think it should be extended to include the police service. That's the message. Naloxone saves lives, and hopefully it can be saved more in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to closing speeches, and I call on Willie Rennie. 6 minutes, Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I've actually quite enjoyed this debate. I sometimes don't pay attention throughout debates, I have to admit, but today I did, because I think there were some excellent contributions to it. I think the core of it, and Richard Simpson, Jim Eadie, and also Dennis Robertson, they were talking about that personalised approach, based on evidence, based on kind of pragmatism almost, making sure that it's professional-led. I think one of the most powerful phrases was from Christine Graham was the personal prison. And I think the drug addicts that I've spoken to talk about that in those very terms, and it must be absolute hell that they cannot escape from that prison. So I think Christine Graham made a very useful contribution. The cost of pharmacies, George Adam and Jamie Hepburn, I think, addressed some of this. The cost of dispensing methadone is not just the cost of procuring the drug, of procuring methadone itself. There's the cost of the consultant room, there's the CCTV security, there's extra staff support, there's the monitoring involved, there's the extra training, but there's also the displaced business that Margot MacDonald has referred to as well. So we shouldn't just think that those apparently big sums that pharmacists receive are all just pure profit, because it's simply not the case. The costs are way and above that. In terms of deaths, the Scottish Drugs Forum have done a useful analysis on the deaths this year, including on the fact that there may have been a heroin drought, which has led to greater experimentation and polydrug use, including methadone, the topping up that Duncan McNeill talked about. So we need to look behind some of these figures for the actual reasons as to why this has happened, rather than the simplistic headlines. It's very few cases where there's just one single cause for a drugs overdose. There's often multiple drug uses as well as other issues concerned. I thought it was really it was a careful contribution from Duncan McNeill, where he was talking about some just won't recover. And I think it's something we actually have to look at. We have to consider that some people cannot be saved. It's a hard thing to say, as Duncan rightly pointed out. But again, that should be in the hands of the professionals to make that judgment. But we sometimes have to accept that some people might not recover at all. The schemes, I think some of the resident... Yes, certainly.
Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Mr Rennie, thank you very much. On that point, although there's individuals who may not wish to, for whatever reason, come off drugs, is it not important still to ensure that they're giving a valuable service to aid them in whatever lifestyle they wish to have?
Willie Rennie.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Dennis Robertson makes an absolutely certain point. I'm not talking about cutting these people off at all. It's actually recognising that some people have just got different motivations, and we need to make sure that the provision, the service that we provide for them, is applicable to them. Yes, certainly.
Duncan McNeill.
For clarity, there are, as I mentioned, some people who are beyond that help, who have been in that addicted situation for many years, just taking it to feel normal. And I don't write off people forever, but for significant periods of time and years, they are not susceptible to commit to recovery. And we are supporting them at a costly expense, not just in financial terms, but at the expense of those who are committed to coming off now.
Willie Rennie.
And I think Richard Simpson addressed some of this point as well. We need to make sure we're making the right decisions about the care that we're providing for people, the treatment that we're providing. So I think he makes a valid point. It's a difficult subject to raise, but I think it's actually a great contribution to the debate. There is a concern also about some of the big services, that they're not sensitive enough to the individual patient need. And we're talking about patients here. We're not sensitive enough. We're actually not being able to provide quickly enough the alternatives. And I think we do need to look at some of the bigger services and how they are providing services. I've been out and about, met many drug addicts in Turning Point in Glasgow, where they've got former addicts who go out into the community and try and help people who are in crisis, and they're able to communicate in a way that many others aren't. Neil Findlay on the links to poverty is absolutely correct. Housing conditions and many other issues are at the root of that. Supported housing schemes in Glasgow, where they're able to gradually move people back into the community with gradually changing the support that's provided to them, is another good service. In Dunfermline, they have a toasty club in the middle of Dunfermline, and I went to visit a few years ago, and I thought I was dressing down for the occasion. I put my jeans on, I thought I looked scruffy, but they all scarpered as soon as I arrived. They disappeared for about 15, 20 minutes, and then one by one they gradually came back in. They must have thought I was a police officer or something. I thought I looked like, I thought I looked perhaps a wee bit more appropriate to the circumstances. I was just a bit, they spotted me straight away. And the point of this...
1 minute left.
The point of saying this is that Duncan McNeill is right. There is actually, communities are feeling the pressure, and we need to recognise this. There is a big divide between drug users and the communities in which they live, and we need to recognise that. I put a posting up on Facebook about drug use the other day, and a lot of people believe that drug users should be cut off. And we need to recognise that there is a huge divide. They do not understand why they're getting the support. We've got a big job to do to convince people about the merits of this. The methadone programme, the other support services, is enlightened self-interest in many ways, of making sure our communities are safe. We need to look beyond this. We need to work together, and I'm glad we've got a consensus. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Jackson Carlaw, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by referring back to the opening speech of the Minister, Rosanna Cunningham? Because so often, and I'm happy to say I play my full part in this, the exchanges in this Parliament are about holding government to account and having a fairly robust and sometimes confrontational, sometimes constructive discussion. But this afternoon's debate, I think, has been one where Parliament is seeking to work with the government and not against the government in the implementation of the Road to Recovery strategy, which all the parties in this Parliament, I think, adopted and supported back in 2008, not least on the intervention at the time and commitment of Annabel Goldie, but with everybody's involvement behind it. And so one of the issues for me in this debate this afternoon is to accept and recognise, and I've been guilty of this myself, that in talking about these issues in anything above a whisper is to risk bringing to the debate a degree of sensationalism and opprobrium which is unhelpful in the way in which it thereafter progresses. And so I'm slightly perplexed, genuinely, as to what Jenny Mara was seeking to achieve this morning. Because there was a suggestion, and I thought Christine Graham brought this out, I've not been quite sure what was at the root of it, but there was a suggestion of a fact being turned into an alternative policy based on a criticism of a section within our community who are tasked with the responsibility of seeking to implement and help with the Road to Recovery programme. And to use pejorative language like methadone millionaires, I think was just unfortunate, and in that sense devalued and brought into this debate something I don't think any of us had anticipated before it began that we would have to deal with. So I think that was unhelpful and not constructive. Yeah.
Jamie Hepburn.
I wonder if Mr Carr would also agree with me, even with the explanation about the ironing out of the differential pay levels. It hardly strikes as me getting the heart of this issue. It's not the big solution for the drugs problem we face.
Jackson Carlaw.
I'm inclined to agree. In fact, I actually wasn't quite sure that it wasn't counterproductive, because it may very well be that the pharmacists who are receiving £1.75 might decide they would like £2.49. And in fact, the consequence of this policy would actually be the reverse. It wouldn't produce, if I understood Jenny Mara's suggestion, that everybody be reduced to a lower rate, some pot of money that could then be diverted somewhere else. It just all struck me as trying to make a new policy out of something that was not that significant. And therefore, and I've now talked about it for a minute and a bit, so it's been a digression in the entire afternoon. I thought that what Annabel Goldie was keen to stress is that we, in 2008, embraced a strategy. And whilst Graham Pearson may talk about what happened before, a notion was not the same as a strategy. And I think what we have been working on in the last few years is a strategy which is beginning to prove that it has a track record of success, not least both in alcohol, actually in drugs terms, in the fact that younger people are no longer the exclusive focus of our concern, but that people who are older than them are at the heart of that. And Jim Eadie said that people should be empowered to decide their own recovery. And I think that in terms of the polarisation of the methadone debate that Annabel Goldie spoke of, part of the problem, and I turn to something Willie Rennie also said about health professionals, is that some have been approaching health professionals precisely because they want to be empowered to decide their own road to recovery, only to find that health professionals, GPs, have been reluctant to support them in their desire to reduce their use of methadone or to come off from that. So, whilst I say we've got to be careful that we speak in a whisper when we discuss these issues, I think it's also important for us to recognise that this road to recovery is not a road to recovery for Scotland, it is a road to recovery for individuals. That road to recovery will always be there, but that we should not be afraid to seek to repair the road or to question aspects of the policy that we are on this road towards if we think that there are issues arising. And so I welcome the contribution that Duncan McNeill made, because it was actually quite challenging. I don't think he was actually, as some were characterising his remarks, as suggesting that people be abandoned. But what he was, I think, saying is that there are moments in time where, when resources are finite, persisting with a particular type of treatment with certain people who clearly don't want to be on that particular path is not probably the correct use of that resource, which could be concentrated more towards others who would benefit from involvement at that point.
1 minute left.
Personal contributions. Experiences came from Mark MacDonald in the Timmer Market Clinic. We also heard from Christine Graham about the experience in her own area. I referred to Jim Eady, but his was one of the most powerful and impassioned of the contributions we heard this afternoon, and was followed by one equally so from Neil Findlay. I suppose the only surprise beyond Jenny Mara for me in the entire afternoon, this is a serious debate and I think it has been conducted in that way, was that Margot MacDonald managed to get Nancy Reagan into it, which, given that Margot is a lady who said no more than many others, was something of a surprise. But it has been a debate in which I think the attendance in the chamber speaks to the genuine commitment and interest from all parties in working together to ensure that progress continues to be made.
Thank you. And I call on Lewis MacDonald, 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. And today's debate has illustrated that drugs policy matters and that there is a real commitment across the chamber to getting it right, albeit there are also different priorities. We have heard concerns about the impact of drug addiction on users and their families. Perhaps the most important and challenging aspect of that is the cycle of poverty, desperation and drug addiction repeating itself from one generation to the next, even as George Adams said, to a third generation. But as Duncan McNeill said, there are also equally strong concerns about the impact of drug use and dependence in the wider community. Drugs and addiction are responsible for many serious crimes, and too many in our communities have suffered the effects of chaotic and antisocial behaviour by drug users in their neighbourhoods, as Neil Findlay vividly described and put in context. Acknowledging that and ensuring that we have the most effective policy approach is not to lack empathy with drug users. Far from it. It is to recognise that we all have an interest in getting it right. Now, Richard Simpson laid out why methadone continues to be an essential part of treatment for heroin addicts. It remains an essential tool, but it is also important to be confident about how and when it is used. Central to that concern has to be the black market in methadone, where a duly prescribed drug is sold for cash with which to buy heroin to use on its own or as a top-up to methadone itself. The user who sells clearly runs a direct risk of harm as a consequence, and methadone sold in the open market, as Willie Rennie said, is a major contributor to drug-related deaths. And Jenny Mara was absolutely right to highlight further issues around the dispensing of methadone by high street pharmacists, an issue which indeed George Adam also mentioned. Jackson Carter suggests that there should be no voices raised above a whisper on these issues. The public expect us to speak out on the issues around drug use which are of concern to them, and we would be doing nobody a service by maintaining that low tone of voice, of course.
Mark MacDonald.
But key is the words and the language which are deployed by members, and we have a responsibility to use language in a very careful manner which does not stigmatise those extremely vulnerable individuals. Would Mr MacDonald not accept that that is the point that is being made here?
Lewis MacDonald.
Well, if that is the point that is being made, then it was clearly wide of the mark, because indeed the issues which Jenny Mara raised were issues around the dispensing of methadone, the same issues which were raised also by Richard Simpson. And the original idea behind dispensing methadone in the community was indeed to reduce stigma and was indeed to try and do that by delivery within the community. That's why the Scottish Drugs Forum, for example, thought it was the right thing to do. But many communities have had a different experience. There is a perception in those cases that delivery of services to the general public has taken second place to the business of dispensing methadone. And indeed, sitting next to Mr MacDonald, George Adam raised that very point when he hit the headline on methadone in Renfrewshire in August of this year. And it's a fair point, and he again will have reflected the views that were coming to him from communities. The very visibility of drug users in those cases is part of the reason why some, like the Scottish Drugs Forum, who supported a community delivery approach, are now more cautious about it. And I would urge ministers to consider the issues around how and when methadone is dispensed, including the very positive and specific proposals made by Richard Simpson, to which Jim Eadie referred. And there must be a strong and decisive approach to the black market in methadone, where that exists. And we know that the damage that black market does to both sellers and buyers, it needs to be tackled. Those guilty of trading in methadone need to feel the full force of the law, as indeed do those who deliberately set out to create high-value markets for drugs such as cocaine and crack cocaine.
Christine Graham.
Can I just get this clear? You've defended things that Jenny Mara has said, maybe not in the chamber, but certainly in the press. Are you saying that you say that there are pharmacists out there making money unnecessarily out of dispensing methadone the way they do it? Is that what you're saying?
There is clearly a disparity in that respect, but it's also very important to say that the call is not for simply looking at the cost, it's at looking at the method and the locus of dispensing. That's why Richard Simpson made this proposal he did. I hope ministers have paid close attention to that and that they will respond accordingly. Graham Pearson highlighted the lack of reliable data, which undermines the objective of having a fully informed debate on progress in delivering the Road to Recovery strategy. The Minister will know I pursued this issue directly with her by way of PQs and also in correspondence and earlier this afternoon. Too little appears to have been done to align the information that is available from before 2008 with the data that is being collected now. Indeed, members of the Scottish Drug Strategy Delivery Commission, established by government, have been involved with in this work over a period of time, and they are concerned about the tendency for government to forget the processes and initiatives undertaken in the past and lessons learned. The effect of this, they say, is demoralising in the field as well as hugely inefficient, and they call on the Scottish Government to take steps to improve its institutional memory. That is not a point, of course, for this current government alone. I hope ministers will recognise we all have an interest in a debate that is fully informed, and I would therefore urge ministers to address the issue of access to information from the whole period of devolution as positively and promptly as they can. Indeed, while debate on this issue is very welcome, it is perhaps surprising that the government have chosen to bring it forward just a few weeks before the data that has been collected on progress in the last 4 years is made available in December. It might have been helpful to publish the data first and then to debate them, or to have the debate fully informed by that, rather than have the debate before we have the data. Indeed, the first-year report of the Scottish Drug Strategy Delivery Commission has highlighted a number of areas where improvements are required, and they too start with the proper recording both of individual cases and of overall progress and trends. They know and they argue that it is impossible to understand, for example, the concerns around people being part in methadone. It is impossible to know how well-founded they are if we do not know how many people who have been assisted in the road to recovery have relapsed or have given up on recovery altogether.
Mark MacDonald.
I'm keen to clarify something which I was attempting to intervene on Mary Fee on. Mary Fee in her speech said firstly that the strategy was failing and a new direction was needed, and then also indicated that she felt a wait of 3 weeks was too much. Is that Labour Party's position now, and what do they think is the alternative that should be offered? Because I haven't heard much on that.
Lewis MacDonald, you're now in your last minute.
Thank you. We certainly need to make full use of the rehabilitation facilities that exist, and there is certainly evidence that that is not yet happening. We do need to see a very strong emphasis on that aspect of policy. And there has been much talk in the course of today about the importance of consensus in drugs policy. I believe there is certainly much common ground on the urgency, on the nature of the challenge, and on the need for effective action. There is also a common interest in getting it right, in the interest of those trapped in the cycle of drugs dependence and of wider communities, and indeed of the wider public interest. And as Christine Graham said, we should not be afraid to have a debate on how best we do that. We should not be afraid of constructive criticism of the rollout of the strategy in order to make it better, and I think that has to be our focus going forward. If ministers recognise the need for continuing review of what works best and provide the leadership that is needed, we will be able to maintain a high degree of agreement in support of the road to recovery, but it is clear that there are areas where improvements are indeed needed.
Thank you very much. I now call on Rosanna Cunningham to wind up the debate. Minister, you have until 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've certainly had an interesting debate, but the debate shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we are talking about people's lives and that we have a duty to be responsible in all that we say and do. Only last week, the Scottish Drugs Forum, experts in the field, articulated their continued support for the road to recovery, which, in their words, articulates a clear and sound vision for services to work to, and it would be unfortunate if party politics were to muddy the waters. I couldn't put it better myself. The debate this afternoon has evidenced for us the complexity of this issue, but that complexity means that those who try to reach for simplistic solutions will fail. This government has never shirked from the challenge drug addiction poses society, and 4 years' hard work is already making a difference. But no one has ever claimed that there wasn't more to be done. I don't think there is any society anywhere in the world has reached that point in respect of drug policy. Everybody here recognises that all drug deaths are more than just statistics. They're tragedies, individual, family and community tragedies. And more needs to be done to get behind those figures and understand what is happening there as well. And I accept that, but I have never not accepted that. There also continues to be stigma from the media, which we do need to address, and emerging legal highs are a constant source of concern. But the delivery of the road to recovery cannot be determined by political timescales. It requires long-term partnership working and collaboration, and huge achievements have already been made. We're beginning to see the successful impact of this government's commitment to increased investment in frontline drug services. So we've heard already of the successes: improved access to treatment, with over 15,600 people entering treatment in a single year alone, 2011-12. Waiting times down to 3 weeks from referral to treatment. And I would still like to challenge Labour, if they are serious in saying that 3 weeks is too long, what do they think it should be? Services increasing, can I just get into this? Services increasingly offering a choice of treatment that meets people's needs, and of course we want to see more of that happening across the country. A world-leading naloxone programme, which in 2011-2012 is setting a pace which internationally has been recognised, and the lowest rates of reported drug use in the general population and young people in a decade. Now, perhaps Mary Fee can tell me what waiting time she thinks is appropriate.
Mary Fee.
I thank the Minister for that. I commend the Government's 3-week waiting time and treatment. The point I was making, and it was a personal view, that 3 weeks can mean the difference between someone committing to coming off drugs and not, but I welcome the 3-week waiting time.
I should very much hope the member does welcome it, since not very many years ago that 3 weeks might have been a year, and we have made huge efforts to get it to where it is. It would be an ideal situation if we could have every single person crossing the threshold and that immediate referral being immediately dealt with in the way of treatment. That would be an ideal situation to be in. I suspect it may be a little while before we can get there. Is everything perfect? Is the problem solved? No, of course it's not. We are not claiming that. Nobody would. But we are starting to see the presence of recovery communities, and I think this is an important part of the debate, because they make a real difference to people's lives. And for the first time, we now know that more people are moving on in their recovery journey. 111 people have taken part in the Scottish Drugs Forum's Addiction Worker Training Project in Glasgow, and that supports, trains and prepares individuals with a history of problem drug and alcohol use to work in social care. And the majority of them have secured full-time jobs in the social care and addiction fields, cementing their own long-term recovery and contributing back to the recovery of others. And I would ask members to just think about that reality for a minute and that success. But we now have to do what we have always said needed to be done, which is move on to the third phase of delivery, and that's about quality. Because the work so far is only the beginning. For recovery to become a reality for everyone who is affected, either directly or indirectly by drugs, we must not start to question our commitment to the national strategy. We now need to start moving with pace to ensure that recovery is at the heart of service provision. Now, the evidence gathering that we have undertaken has allowed us to identify the existence of that ageing cohort of drug users with complex medical problems. But that in itself then presents more and new challenges that we will need to address. We're going to need to get a better connection between clinical treatment with follow-up support in the community whenever it's needed to ensure that the recovery is sustainable for people moving towards a life free of problem drug and alcohol addiction. I know that is something everybody here wants to see too, and that means a renewed emphasis on support for sustained recovery in communities. I want to see quality at the root of services, people having access to the right services at the right time, with support from a workforce who have the knowledge, skills and attitudes to support people into and through their recovery, but this takes time. I want to see good quality data that tells the full story, good quality data, information and evidence that tells us about opiate replacement therapies and their place in recovery. But I also want good quality data that tells us where we need to learn and improve, and how we can continue to provide evidence-informed interventions for those that need it most. Now, Lewis MacDonald talked about the timing of this debate, and why did I come now and not in December? Well, I have a very simple answer for that. The independent expert group on opiate replacement therapies that I commissioned last month is meeting for the first time tomorrow, and I wanted an opportunity for them to be able to look at a debate that takes place in this chamber and the range of issues raised by members in this chamber.
Richard Simpson.
It was really on the previous point, Minister, Presiding Officer, if I could ask the Minister, that if you have a situation in which Ayrshire and Arran are prescribing methadone at a rate of 212 per 100,000 and Forth Valley are prescribing it at 56, and there's a huge range between the two, then we clearly haven't got a full understanding of the picture, because they can't all be providing the best service. So can I ask her to make sure that the prescribing is actually related to the number of people coming into treatment, so we can understand these issues?
Minister, can we have some order, please, for the Minister's speech?
I would expect, given that we do this on a locally based system, that there would be variations, because there are different choices and decisions being made, and that is an important part of the progress of what we are doing. We've already heard of different areas prescribing in different measure. Now, it is worth, there is an interesting question behind what Richard Simpson is raising, but it isn't just about the need for uniformity across the whole country. So the group that I was talking about, the opiate replacement, the group looking at opiate replacement therapies, will be objectively considering the evidence supporting the role of those therapies in the treatment of substance misuse, and that does already, at my behest, include things like addressing the question of leakage, and that will mean looking fairly robustly at the prescribing guidelines and considering whether or not they are perhaps in some cases not being entirely adhered to. But that's what I've asked them to look at. I will also be asking them to take on board the comments by the Conservatives today to extend their review to include the broader rehabilitation picture, including the use of residential rehab, to take up some of the points about the variation across the country of the use of those available beds. And I do look forward to the outcomes from that group, which will be considered by this Parliament. But I do need to say to a number of members, including Jenny Mara, that there are a range of treatments currently not just on offer but being taken up. Of the 15,600 people who entered treatment in 2011-12, over 8,000 were given structured preparatory and motivational interventions. Prescribed drug treatment, including methadone, was offered to 3,700. That's the figure that I was referring to, fewer than 20%. There were community-based detox given to 345, community-based support and rehab to over 6,000, and indeed residential detox and rehab to about 678. Now, if you add all that up, you'll discover it comes to more than 15,600. Why? Because frequently more than one treatment is offered and people take up more than one treatment. So the notion that people are on methadone alone is actually not necessarily true. And I think that members who feel that that might be happening perhaps need to do just a little bit extra work to discover the truth. There are a number of contributions that I do wish... No, I need to get on because I've only got a very short space of time now. There are a number of contributions that I thought were very powerful. Richard Simpson, as I would have expected, raising a great many very important points, and I want time to have a look at some of the specific things he talked about, and I will come back to him in that regard. I thought Jim Eadie's contribution around methadone usage was very well focused, and indeed he will be happy to know that many of the points he raised are precisely the areas I have already tasked the review to investigate. In respect to Duncan McNeill's contribution, I think that's actually quite an important point he was making, because there are people who may never come to a point where they want treatment. And you know, if there's over 60,000 people with a drug problem in Scotland, there are many who are not coming forward for treatment. But I have met individuals who have been on drugs for a very long time. Something snaps one day and then they're off. 32 years. I sat speaking to a woman in Dundee who had been a drug user for 32 years. One day she woke up, decided she'd had enough, presented herself to Narcotics Anonymous, and that was it. So I don't want us to be in a position where we assume everybody, that there are people out there who cannot be dealt with. They can, but it isn't easy. It is tough, and I do take the point he's making, and I have really run out of time, so I have to say I'm accepting the Conservative and Liberal Democrat amendments, but sadly not the Labour amendment.
That concludes the debate on the road to recovery drug strategy. We now move to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion number 4737 in the name of Kenny McCaskill on a legislative consent motion, Prisons Interference with Wireless Telegraphy Bill, UK legislation. I call on Kenny McCaskill to move the motion. Cabinet Secretary. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. There are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 4719.3 in the name of Jenny Mara, which seeks to amend motion number 4719 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham on road to recovery drug strategy be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4719.3 in the name of Jenny Mara is as follows. Yes, 34. No, 68. There were 12 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 4719.1 in the name of Annabel Goldie, which seeks to amend motion number 4719 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham on road to recovery drug strategy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 4719.2 in the name of Willie Rennie, which seeks to amend motion number 4719 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham on road to recovery drug strategy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4719 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham as amended on road to recovery drug strategy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4737 in the name of Kenny McCaskill on prisons interference with wireless telegraphy bill UK legislation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time.